Good evening, this is Tim Johnson, and tonight a special meeting of the Brattleboro Selectboard aired live here on BCTV. In fact, this special meeting includes nearly all of the sitting department heads, because one of the first items of business is an update on the comprehensive review of town operations and financial planning. And of course, you saw that Board Chair David Gartenstein just entered the room as well. In addition, tonight, work on the FY16 utilities budget, parking budget, and solid waste budget, discussion about the Green Street retaining wall, a tiny grant program for the town from the Vermont Association of Conservation Commissions, and an additional presentation on proposed zoning codes from Planning Director Rod Francis. All that and more coming up next. The Brattleboro Select Board is here on BCTV. Thank you for watching.
Good evening. It's May 12, 2015, and we're here for our weekly Select Board meeting. This is a special Select Board meeting which has been scheduled to discuss the comprehensive review of town operations, our enterprise fund budgets, which are utilities, parking, solid waste, and then to deal with the zoning bylaw amendment presentations, and also talk about grant-related matters relating to the Green Street retaining wall. Before we call the first item, and I know the meeting has been officially warned, is that fair to say?
Yes, it is.
Excellent. Thank you, Jan. Before we call the first agenda item, and in the absence of scheduled items for chair's remarks and board remarks and public participation, I have been asked to present a proclamation and to announce a series of events that are going to be occurring over Memorial Day weekend. And so what I would note is that we are coming up on the 150th anniversary of the, well, I don't know if anniversary is the right word, 150th commemoration of the Civil War and the conclusion of the Civil War. And the Select Board has been asked to consider the following proclamation. Whereas the Civil War was concluded 150 years ago after 4 years of continuous combat, and whereas that conclusion amounted to a victory which established freedom and unity for our country and its citizens, and whereas that victory was gained at a great expense of life and treasure in Vermont, and whereas Brattleboro made an extraordinary contribution to this cause, and whereas that contribution included the military leadership of many Brattleboro citizens and the ultimate sacrifice by 48 Brattleboro citizens, and whereas the Brattleboro American Legion has undertaken a program this Memorial Day to honor these Brattleboro soldiers with lectures by scholars, a banquet featuring Howard Coffin, and a ceremony on the Brattleboro Common. Now, therefore, the town of Brattleboro, in recognition of the bravery of its citizens and the cause for which they fought and died, dedicates this Memorial Day to the memory of those who contributed to this great cause, to the victory they achieved, and to the ideas and ideals for which they fought and gave their lives. I would note that there's a calendar of events, including lectures and presentations and discussions, and this banquet, and Tom Costello, who is playing an organizing role in these events, was not able to be here this evening, but will be here at the next Tuesday's Select Board meeting to talk a little bit more about these events and to invite everybody to participate. So I'd like to ask if there's any comment or discussion, and if not, I hope to be able to get a vote in favor of that proclamation.
I think it's still going on the South. I'm just saying. The war of northern aggression. I don't think it's over yet. No, that's a great proclamation.
Anybody else have any comments? All those in favor of that proclamation, please say aye. Aye. Anybody opposed or abstaining? That carries 5-0. Thank you. So the next item on the agenda is there anything else from any board members or anybody who's in attendance that's not on the agenda? Is that? Yeah, totally. And if anybody wants to see the schedule, it's available. All right then, so the first item on the agenda is unfinished business, update about the comprehensive review of town operations and financial planning project. This item was actually on the agenda about 4 weeks ago, but we had a thinly populated meeting with a lot of business that needed to be tended to, and so we put it off until today. Peter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Indeed, we were going to do this update a month ago, and as the memorandum in your backup indicates, because of the necessity to keep moving in order to stay on our time frame for hopefully completing a couple of important milestones before the end of the summer, we have continued on with what we had anticipated that we would ask you on April 7th, whether you felt we were ready to proceed. So I want to start by saying that the presentation I'm about to make hopefully will leave you as a group comfortable with where we are, the progress we've made, and the direction that we are continuing to pursue. But if you have any concerns about that after we've discussed it here over the next few minutes, we recognize that you haven't had a chance to participate in the process yet until tonight. And if you were to direct that we adjust our course in some manner, we'd be happy to do that. It may or may not have some implication to the time frame in which we would complete the task. I'll reiterate a couple of things that we've already covered in early discussions before we did a full update, just to set the kind of the foundation for where we are now and the substantive work that's ongoing. In order to think about the opportunities for operational improvements and efficiencies, potential cost reductions, although I want to underscore now and every time we ever talk about this effort that it's not just about saving money. We are always looking for those opportunities, and I know you as a board and the staff have put a tremendous amount of effort over the years into that. This process that we're in is intended to accomplish that wherever there may be still an opportunity at this moment to identify potential cost savings, but more so to look beyond just the cost of town government to how we function and whether there are ways in which we can improve internal operations or service delivery to the community in ways that may or may not save money but would be just better town government, more efficient, more responsive, in some ways perhaps updating from things that were created as programs at a time when they made really good sense for the community, but have been maintained without further review by select boards or staff, and so where we might have an opportunity to take a fresh look and decide whether or not it's necessary to continue certain functional areas. So that's really broadly characterized. As we get a little deeper into the conversation tonight, and then especially as we get into the later stages of this, it'll be clearer what we mean by that broader view beyond just the cost savings. But to get there, we challenged ourselves to think about the operations of the town in a manner that broke the town's line item budget, departmental line item budgets, into programs. We've talked about this before, but I just want to reiterate that it's not turning our budget into a program budget. We may or may not choose to do that. That's really a multi-year process to do that well, and it would be subject to additional review. We'd want to offer you some additional advice. You'd certainly want to give consideration to what would be required in terms of process to get there, and whether that feels like it would be worthwhile to actually convert the full structure of our budgeting process and our budget documents. But what we have done in the first stage of this process is think programmatically by taking the line item budget that you were in the process of adopting, town meeting was in the process of adopting this year for FY16, and dividing that into programmatic pieces. So we provided that to you in preparation for April 7th. It's in your backup again tonight. If you have any questions about those programmatic pieces, we'd be happy to address them. All the departments are represented here this evening. We just want to reiterate that it is not a finished piece of work. We did that in a real hurry. And I want to thank the department heads for how aggressively they got at that piece and the rest of this, understanding that as we hit the other threshold moments, when we complete the comprehensive review and then complete the long-term financial plan, those are going to be much more finished documents that we'll present in an effort to actually work with you to make some decisions about town government and where we go from here. The programmatic piece was something we needed to do in a hurry in order to be able to do the other two pieces this year. And I felt a sense of urgency that October is going to be on us before we know it in terms of managing town's finances, and wanted to be able to be in a position where we had a long-term financial plan at that time. So the programs are here. They are a good first step in demonstrating the thoughtfulness of how we allocate costs across the different service areas of the town. You'll note that they're not simply arithmetic divisions. So if there's 4 programs in a particular department, it's not 25% allocated to each program, but rather a more careful analysis done by the department heads as to exactly how the pieces of their departmental operations fit together into a whole. We moved from that in the beginning of March into the process of identifying potential items for further study that would go into the comprehensive review document. So there's been a brainstorming operation or process going on to identify many items, some of which will make the report, some of which won't, but it got a process going. So the departments within their own management teams internally developed some ideas. I've been now meeting with each of them about their lists, and we've been refining those lists and adding some things and subtracting some things from them. We're almost complete with that process, and again, if you provide a thumbs up to us tonight to keep going in the direction we're headed, the next step will be to have, over the next 3 to 4 weeks, complete the analysis related to the items that are on that final list of potential improvements for the town, potential efficiencies. The departments will each complete their portion of the report. There'll be a separate list of items similar to the departmental items that mostly Patrick, but Patrick and I will be working that have town-wide implications across the departmental boundaries. Then we will assemble during June all of those component pieces into the comprehensive review report. I'll be writing the summary information and the overview information and giving a better, more complete description of our process and our intent here and how we think it'll be helpful to future financial decision making in the town. And we hope to present that report to you at the July 7th Select Board meeting. At that point, we would then continue on, assuming that we stay this course. We present to you the comprehensive review document on July 7th. If you're comfortable with it at that point, and we've had sufficient review around that for you to feel prepared for us to move on and create the long-term financial plan, it will be based to some degree on what's in the comprehensive review document, but it's not direct linkage. In other words, there will be, we hope, content in the comprehensive review that's going to be useful beyond just the next wave of decision making, but actually over a period of years. So the long-term financial plan that we'll create in July and August for presentation at the first September meeting, I believe that's September 2nd. The intent of that is to actually be a decision tool in the review of the proposed FY17 budget that will show a 5-year forecast out into the future, so that we can see the implications if you made certain decisions related to that FY17 budget to increase or decrease the investment in certain areas of town government, what the implications of that look like when we get 3 and 5 years down the road, and be able to review options as we face the economic challenges that the town does face, and allocating our resources and trying to maintain a stable tax rate, that you'll be able to see what those choices look like, not just in the fiscal year that we're discussing at the time, but for the longer term of the town. So that's where we are, how we've gotten to where we are, and how we intend to proceed through the rest of the summer. If you're comfortable with all of that, I'd be happy to answer any questions or ask the departments to go into any more detail that you might wish to see. I did include in tonight's package, so that you'd have a sense of where we're going with this comprehensive review document, some samples. I undertook an effort very similar to this. I know that you already knew that from the hiring process last fall. We talked about it quite extensively. Down in Palm Beach back in 2007, we completed a comprehensive review of town operations there. And I thought it might be helpful, primarily actually in our work as a management team, to share some examples of the range of, from quite small dollar impact items to very large, multi-million dollar impact items, and also from very narrowly defined areas of service to the community to quite broad townwide implications. The intent of this is to not be so narrowly defined as to constrain us from looking at everything that seems worthwhile to look at. And so hopefully those examples from that process give a feel for that. And I'd be happy to address any of that further with you if that's helpful tonight, and the department heads can speak to their programmatic allocation of costs if you'd like to go into that in any greater detail.
I'm mostly interested in the brainstorming item.
Okay.
Because I don't see the
product.
a list of brainstormed
Correct.
ideas. So rather than asking you to focus on any specific brainstormed idea,
Sure.
Which poses the risk of giving it highlighted and too much importance,
Right.
could you just talk with us generally about
Sure.
what are these brainstormed ideas and what's the plan?
Sure. Yep. First of all, let me just say I very intentionally didn't include those lists in here because they're not refined yet. We're in the process of refining them, and by the very nature of the exercise, some of them might cause concern to people unnecessarily if they start worrying about how things might change in town government in ways that, before we even get to producing the report, we decide aren't really appropriate to further consider. So for that reason, I didn't circulate the list. I would say the range of ideas that we're considering is appropriate to Brattleboro, but otherwise reflects the kind of thinking that you see in the samples. That's why I'm circulating the samples from what we did down in Palm Beach, so that in some cases it's very specific to a department, and in some cases very minor, both in scope of service and dollar impact, but where we think that there is a constituency in the community that might be concerned if it were to change, and so we think it ought to be highlighted as a policy matter, even though it's small impact, let's say, or limited impact. And then in other cases, there are items as in the Palm Beach example, regarding the modification of the sewer system in order for it to function differently, in order to save hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in operating costs. It required millions of dollars of investment in the capital infrastructure, but it was at a time when that system was going to need replacement. And so there was an opportunity to replace it and modify it rather than just replace it in kind. It did cost several $1 million additional. It was going to be, I think, about a $6 or a $7 million job, and ended up being about a $9 million job. But in so doing, the town is now saving, close to $500,000 a year in operating costs. So the payback is pretty quick, and then forever after that. We're looking at some things not on that same dollar magnitude, but of that scale of importance to the community, as well as some very precise areas of service delivery.
I guess my only inquiry is whether that brainstorming process has gone on with you and the department heads. There might be a time when doing that with board members, either as a group or
Sure.
individually,
Okay.
Might also add to the content of what you're looking at.
Absolutely. I think that's a good point. I think the best way to address it is that we continue on with the process, especially given the aggressive time frame that's involved. And when we deliver the comprehensive review to you in midsummer, that we all consider that to be a draft. Mm-hmm. And if at that point you see things that aren't there, if you look at what is there and believe there are additional things you would like us to take a look at, it's a living document anyway. We hope that over a period of years, some of the things are going to be relevant immediately and maybe affect the FY17 budget, but other things are going to be just the beginning of a conversation that's going to take, much more review and consideration and decision making over a longer period of time. So in that sense, even what we give you in July is an ongoing, is meant to be ongoing beyond that moment in time. And if you at that point say, well, how about this and how about that? And, we'd be happy to then take up some additional topics and review those and add them into the document at a later date and consider the document more final at that time. There's no problem with that. I will say the departments have done a very complete job in this brainstorming process. What we are winnowing out some things that we think either are more administrative in nature, so to the degree that there are some good ideas that have been identified and we ought to do them, we're just going to do them and then we'll document those and report them to you, or where upon interaction between us we're finding that maybe they don't feel like they rise to the same level of importance for your review as some of the other things. One other aspect that I think is worth mentioning is from a pure cost savings point of view, and I will say that you as a board warned me of this when we have talked in the past about undertaking this effort. From a pure cost savings point of view, there's no more low-hanging fruit in Brattleboro. And there's not going to be that many items in this report that are, are you willing to not do this anymore because we'll save X amount of dollars? You've been through that a lot. You have already been through that as a board in the time that you've been together, and your predecessors have been through that, and I know from the staff that it's been almost annual now for quite a long time in town because of the nature of town finances and trying to control a tax rate that is relatively high compared to other communities around. So we get that, and we're not putting in front of you things that you have recently reviewed and decided, unless there is some new information or some new context that we think would be helpful to your consideration. We will have some things in the report that are posing those kinds of questions. Should we continue to do X or Y? And if we don't, it'll save money. But more, the context of the majority of the items that we'd be bringing forward would be more of the nature of, if we do something differently than we've been doing it, the look and feel of it might be noticed in the community. It might save money, or it might cost us a little bit of money, or it might cost some money on the front end, but probably save money down the road. But we're going to have quite a few more nuanced items that we bring forward to you, that we're only bringing them forward because we think that they have the potential to be improvements in how we function as a government and how we serve the community. But where there's enough complexity and enough pros and cons that need to be weighed that it feels to us like a policy question for you rather than an administrative decision for us.
After reading this, I'm a little embarrassed that, as a board, we haven't undertaken this, to this degree previously. I know we've done it every year on the, because we have to coming up into budget, but I just like how this is going. I mean, I can see it's going to be incredibly helpful. So it's good to see it down on paper, yes, instead of in the 11th hour, and when we're battling to try to figure out how we're going to do it, that this is going to, help in that process. So I'm very happy about it.
And it feels like an essential tool,
right,
that we as a board
I can't believe we haven't done
have
this
identified needing, but not discovered on our own. And I also want to say I'm impressed and encouraged by the timeline. It feels like developing this sooner rather than later will have really important financial impact on the town, maybe not immediately, but in the long term. So I just appreciate the work that's gone into it in the midst of many other urgent matters that have been attended to recently. So I'm really excited about this tool.
Thank you. If I might, I know that board members are having their turn here, but I'd like to echo that it is an intense process, and we are proceeding at a very aggressive pace in order to have this be able to be meaningful before the next budget cycle. Otherwise, we'd have had to go through another one just kind of doing the best we can rather than being informed by this work. That's requiring a tremendous amount of effort from the department heads and their teams to produce the body of work. I'm doing the best I can to provide good direction. It's a bit of a process that we're feeling our way through together, particularly in this brainstorming effort. For them to be challenged without it being sort of a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 checklist, but where by the essence of the process, what I'm asking them to do is do really hard thinking, creative thinking about how we might function differently, both internally and in our relationship with the community. And to be doing that while we're facing a relatively heavy load of basic daily and weekly and monthly work is a lift, and they're doing great, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think also one other thing I want to say is I've heard, and I think David Scholes particularly has said numbers of times, and I have felt the wisdom of budgets don't necessarily improve when the approach is a constrictive one. And so what I like is that swinging door. It's like constriction and expansion. It's looking at expenditures from a very broad perspective, which feels healthier in terms of financial planning. So I recognize that your instinct there was really helpful.
Gee, thanks.
Yeah.
Blushing.
It's funny, these are really kind of insightful comments, and as I was going through, I was having the experience of, I'm looking at the budget again. And so I came up with a couple of questions, and probably this maybe isn't the right time to ask about it. I'll ask one and then see. I was looking through the utilities budget, the wastewater budget, and there was a vehicle in there, and a conversation about purchasing it out of the operating fund. And is it typical that things in the utility funds get purchased from the operating fund? I thought that they ran separately and distinctly, and that there wasn't, we wouldn't come to the operating fund for $40,000 for a Bobcat.
Right. That's actually a great question. I don't know what it's been typical to do. It is a vehicle that will be bought with cash if you approve it. And for that reason doesn't need to be shown with any kind of borrowing for capital. But Steve, I don't know whether you want to.
What I'd like to do, that is a specific
really,
utilities budget related question.
It's really so it's not the time to sit to
no, it's the next item on the agenda. After we go into utilities, into water and sewer commissioners.
Okay.
I know Steve was ready.
I know he was.
He was going.
No, it's just really, I didn't understand how the finance.
I would say from a broader view, not to be specific about that, and I don't know the history of what you have and haven't bought with cash, or rather with operating funds from the in the utility fund. But I would say, particularly in an enterprise fund, that if you're buying with cash rather than with either setting aside funds for later major capital improvement or borrowing in order to complete that capital improvement, it's not inappropriate to spend it from operating. So.
I was just wondering if I could, when my septic system goes kaflooey, if I could borrow the Bobcat to dig it up.
No.
That's what I figured. So. You're welcome. So you buy the Bobcat.
Looking comprehensively at how we do the business of the town is something that we've needed to do for a long time. So I want to thank everybody for their work going through this, making sure that we're delivering services efficiently and that we're delivering the services that we need to deliver in the right way really is necessary. So we're really glad to see the effort going on. I don't know that you need a formal endorsement. Does anybody have any concern about the way we're proceeding other than to say, yea, verily go forth and continue?
I don't know about verily.
Well, all right.
Actively.
Excellent. So thank you very much for the presentation.
You're welcome.
All right. So the next matter, anybody else want to say anything? The next matter on the agenda, I believe, since I can't find my agenda, is to convene as Water and Sewer Commissioners, right? So I move to convene as Water and Sewer Commissioners. We have a motion to convene as Water and Sewer Commissioners. Any discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Anybody opposed or abstaining? That carries 5-0. Peter, how are we going to proceed this evening with the presentation of the department heads all leaving? See ya. Thanks for coming.
The ones who aren't involved in presenting a budget to you this evening, or Rod and his
I've never seen such
land use
happy faces
regulations.
in my life.
How are we going to go ahead and deal with this
yes.
budget? You want to do the presentation?
I would like to give a brief overview, very brief overview, a few sentences, and then go budget by budget to have the appropriate staff members come to the table and actually give whatever additional overview they'd like to give, or at least answer your questions. My overview is brief because I'm recommending these budgets to you, having reviewed them with the staff who prepared them, and we've made some revisions together. We, I believe, are proposing to you very tight, responsible budgets. By way of example, the first one you're going to talk about in a couple of minutes here is Water and Sewer Commissioners. The rate study that was done for you, the rate model that was produced, assumes a 2% increase per year in operating expenses for the utilities fund. The budget that's being proposed before you is 1.6% increase. So even at 2% a year, given energy costs and other things that are related to an operation on this scale, you know, it'll be good if we work through this 5-year process that the model represented and actually end up only averaging about a 2% increase per year. The fact that the first year out of the gate we're proposing a 1.6% increase is opportunistic in some ways. It's not all things that have been achieved, but it does represent some efficiencies that have been accomplished already, and Steve and Hannah can speak to that in greater detail if you want to take a deeper dive into it. But the bottom line is that with a 1.6% increase in the water and sewer, we're in a good position in terms of both the economy of the expenditures for that operation and for the 5-year series of rate increases that you approved a year ago to continue on that path and provide plenty of financial security in terms of the substantial fund balance that's appropriate for this operation, given the magnitude of the infrastructure involved and the potential, the age of that infrastructure, the potential for some substantial costs, some of which are being planned for. We're prepared to talk about the water tank up at SIT today. It's in the plan, in the capital plan for this year for utilities. But there could well be surprises in this system as well, just as we've had other surprises with town infrastructure, given that some of it is quite old. So the full picture here is, you know, you made a good plan a year ago and you began implementing it, and a year later we're right about where you expected to be, but even a little better because of only the 1.6% increase instead of the 2%. I won't talk in detail about the other budgets till we get to them later in the meeting, but they're in similar condition, you know, in terms of rate of increase and really very little change from what you would have expected in terms of year-over-year change in cost or operation.
But I got to ask a follow-up question before we ask Stephen. If you want to come on up, this would be a good time. This is a 1.6% increase in expenses, but we're going to increase rates by 2%? Or are we going to increase rates by 1.6%?
The rates are actually increasing by more than 2%. The blended rate increase is 4%. There's a portion that's increasing 6% and a portion that's increasing 2%. I'm getting a nod from John. That's what I remember, and that's correct.
The rate increases we set last year are going to continue, but our expenses are not going up as much this year as we contemplated last year, which means that we're going to build up more of a surplus to support the long-term health and ability to repay those $32 million in bonds.
That's correct, by about $23,000. The difference, by not adjusting the rate increase, and adjusting the rate increase would require changing the ordinance. We wouldn't recommend that you do that for two reasons. One is because this is so close, and $23,000 is not a lot of difference. And because it is slightly to the good, it's not an irresponsible windfall to the fund. It's slightly to the good, but the $23,000 compared to the overall magnitude of managing this operation prudently is
Not material.
That's right. Yep. Thank you.
Steve, please.
Good evening.
Hey.
Steve Barrett, Director of Public Works.
Hannah O'Connell, Highway Utility Superintendent.
So I'm prepared to do an overview what the board has, so the public also will just review the different items within the budget. I would like to comment, when we did talk about, when we're talking about the finances and we're talking about this 5-year rate structure, we also need to keep in mind that after we complete the Black Mountain sewer, gravity sewer project, that's going to be a good time where the project will be completely closed out. So we'll know the actual final expenses on this $32.8 million project. So that would be like next year or the next year after that we go over with finance, and they would make recommendations to the board. And because this is our 7th year in our rate structure, this board passed a 5, but there was a previous 5-year ordinance that was passed by the board. So it's been pretty successful when you really look at it. This rate structure is based on 7 years of history. So with that, you've pretty much covered the revenue portion, I think. I just had a small note that says that basically we're in the 2nd year of this 5-year increase, and that it looks pretty, the utility by itself looks healthy. So now I'll get more into the operations budget, and the first part of the budget is what we call Pleasant Valley Water Treatment and Wells expense. That's your drinking water supply, and those are the costs to keep the drinking water supplied to the residents of the town of Brattleboro, and to also provide fire protection to the town. The budget's pretty much level funded, and I guess really John, with his contract for the fuel oil, has been very helpful, and it shows here in the utility the same good rate that we got for fuel oil for the general budget is going to bleed over into the utilities division, and we're going to recognize a pretty good savings at the facilities, because the water treatment plant and the wastewater plant both are pretty good consumers of oil. Even though they have supplement of other energy sources, they still consume energy. So that provides probably the biggest savings. The water distribution and storage, that's all the piping in between. That supplies all the hydrants, all the water mains. And that, we've actually had a reduction because of staff changes. So we're bringing in some new people, and the staff's salaries are a little bit lower, and that's reflected, that changes that budget line item. So overall, that's reduced by about 6%. We did increase flushing overtime and seasonal help. The utilities division does have a couple seasonal people that help with painting hydrants and helping with water mains and such in the summer. Wastewater treatment, the overall budget has been reduced by 2.5%. Again, that's really because of the fuel. We have seen an increase in the chemical cost, and we've also, one note I do make here is we've still been working on some of the odors that the facility does omit. We've made some changes here. We really started recognizing some odors in February after we had closed out this project and settled with the engineering and the contractors. And so that's been something that we've been trying to determine all the reasons why we're having some odor problems, and then how we can really reduce those odors so that we're a pleasant neighbor. And so there are some challenges there, but we put some additional money in the budget to address those issues. We have tried some odor control devices. We're actively doing it now. We've decreased the amount of complaints, but there still is some problems. We've also met with the Morningside Morningside Condo Association, and we met with, they had a good turnout. There's probably close to 50 to 75 people to discuss their concerns, and some of the industrial users in the neighborhood also. So just so the board's aware, I know that you read it in your monthly reports that we put out, but also so the public knows, we are addressing those issues, and this budget also puts additional money for odor control.
Steve, is that in the chemicals? Is that
Yes.
the 20,000?
Yeah, there's certain treatments that we can add. Some of them are more biological that you add into the treatment water itself, and others are what I like to call the large Febreze, which it basically sequesters the odors within the treatment plant confines. Our hope is, when I've talked to the town manager and also talked to the residents of Morningside and our other neighbors there, is to try to contain our odors within our fence line, which we believe is possible, but it's going to take some work. And also, we're going to do additional research on our engineering and our process.
Well, it's a new plant, basically, so.
It's a new plant, and it's
Nothing, but you could have some bugs.
but there are some processes in the way that we do, the way we treat the waste that can affect this.
Well, I mean, it is pretty strong odor right into downtown.
Yeah.
Pretty consistently, particularly when the wind's blowing from the south there.
Yeah.
And glad to hear that we're focusing on it and looking into it.
Yeah, and really in the last few weeks, I believe it's been less. And of course, I live downtown, so when I step out the door, it kind of sets the tone for the day. And we've encouraged people when they do have odor complaints to call us. So we've documented all these different calls because not necessarily is it all to the wastewater treatment plant. We had a call for odors on Old Guilford Road, and there's a balance here. At one time, the plant didn't emit any odors, but we had we had the odor company, and they had a certain amount of odors, and they dealt with their situation. And so, the finger was, well, maybe it's the odor, maybe it's the wastewater treatment plant. And we got a lot of those odor complaints resolved with the odor company. They've invested in a certain amount of chemicals that keep the odors down, so that's been good. But we did find a break. I got a call on a Sunday from a resident who was out taking a walk, and there was a break on one of our force mains in the Fort Dummer Park. So that ended up being the source of the odor at the time. So it's a moving target. We have to look at the collection system and also look at the plant.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Sewer mains, that's pretty much, that's all the sewer mains in town. That's staff salary. There's been a slight increase in that. In the administration, there's also payments made from utilities to the general fund for services. The finance department provides services for the utilities with billing, and the finance department also tracks our payroll. So there's an exchange of funds from the utilities to the general fund to pay for those expenses. Another expense would be the utilities division actually uses the general fund's garage on Fairground Road, so our rent is paid. So those are there's a little increase in the funds that are paid from the utilities to the general fund this year, but that's what that line item represents, and that comes out of administration. Moving on to equipment maintenance, it's really level funded. Jobbing is where we may go out and work on somebody's particular wastewater service or their line. That's level funded. And then if you would like, I could enter now into a brief discussion about capital and then entertain some questions.
Dave has a question about financing a vehicle.
Yeah, I thought.
Yeah, it's just if utility fund is utility fund, it's supposed to be, I understood it as being self-sustaining. So.
And it is.
So why would we take operating fund money?
We're not.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
I read it wrong.
It's utility fund operating as opposed to utility fund capital.
Okay.
Yeah, right.
When you say operating fund, I think about the money we spend.
Right. Yeah, it's not general fund money, it's utility operating.
Solve that one.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great.
Sure.
Yeah, okay. So the first item is Black Mountain Tank. We've been conducting research. We've hired an engineering firm to review the different options. This has been going on for several years. We've narrowed down our options to replacing a metal. This is a 1 million gallon welded together steel tank that was put in 1966. It's on Black Mountain Road up by the School for International Living. It supplies backup water for all of Putney Road in the case of large fires, and it also would supply water to the north end in the event of a water main break. So it's very critical to our infrastructure. If we had a problem with our treatment system, we have approximately 5 to 6 million gallons in storage throughout town, including at Pleasant Valley. We have 3 million gallons there, and that's important. So if you did have a problem at your treatment facility, you have water to supply for fire and for drinking water for several days. And we also have a backup water supply system, but that will not produce enough water for the usage per day. So this is pretty instrumental in the system. So last year we had over $400,000 in there. We've narrowed it down to replacing it with another steel tank. The difference is the new steel tanks are glass fused and they're bolted together. And we're currently in the process of doing a study of the water system to see what the demands are. And this option would allow construction, if feasible, for a smaller tank. So in other words, instead of a 1 million gallon tank, the utility may elect or recommend to you as water and sewer commissioners to build a 750,000 gallon tank, which would be less money. But the advantage to this particular type of design, it can be added to. So you can build a 750,000 gallon tank today, and then later on you could increase the capacity up to 1 million. So that's a nice feature with this particular design. But we still are doing a study of the water system to actually come up with what we really feel the demands are, if the demands are right. Years ago, when you had a lot of factories, there was a lot more water usage, and so our usage is really down compared to what it used to be in the 60s and the 70s. Water conservation, we used to average probably 1.8 to 1.9 million gallons a day. Now we're about 1.2. So, water consumption's down. That may change the size of the tank, or it may not, because you still have these large buildings, you still have the same fire load, so we may need 1 million. So we're asking to continue to fund the capital fund this year with a fairly large expenditure of $695,000 to go along with the $425,140 that we have in the budget for basically $1.1 million to replace this tank. And what we've done is there's a lot of other, as we go through the capital, you'll see where there were sufficient funds into the water capital improvement fund and the wastewater, so we're not going to fund those with any additional money this year. We're hoping to keep these expenses in the capital fairly flat, so that it's not 1 million this year and then 200,000 the next year. This kind of goes along with trying to keep things steady as far as the expenditures of the capital.
David?
Yeah, Steve, you mentioned a concrete tank will cost approximately 25% more, and it looks like you got 50 years out of the steel tank that's in place now.
Right.
And hoping to get a little bit more time out of it. How long does the concrete tank last compared to the new glass fuse?
They don't give you much more. In fact, the other thing I just got after this writing, now I've discovered that the actual concrete costs could exceed 30% more than the steel. And they'll tell you about the same lifespan as actually the steel. So logistically,
concrete doesn't rust. So
right. And this new tank is glass fused. They actually heat the panels, and it's actually glass, so there won't be any rust that's going to adhere to that. It's actually it's a flexible glass. It has the molecules are different, and what it does is it's basically capsulated in glass, but structurally it's built so it has flexibility. So the concrete tank also, logistically, it's quite difficult. What they do is they actually, if you have enough room, they pour these prefabricated panels on site. Being a school where it is, the time to do that, it interrupt, and also they don't feel they can actually really do it because this tank is elevated up onto a little bluff, if you will, or hill, and they don't feel that they can actually reach it. So we spent a lot of time doing research.
Yeah.
It's not as desirable.
Thanks.
Can I inquire, we have that $410,000 in the bank from prior allocations, and so adding the 695 would take us to $1 million and change to be able to build it this year? Is that fair to say?
Yes.
So that 410 is part of the surplus that we're carrying, but it's committed money. And it's committed in a separate fund. It's not just general fund committed, it's utilities fund committed.
That's right.
Thank you.
Would you like me to proceed with the other?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Chestnut Hill, that's been going on for quite some time, and really, you know, it goes back.
Forever.
It goes back probably 6 or 7 years, and this has been a project really with our staffing levels just been difficult to get our arms around it. We did complete the Pleasant Valley reservoir study, which we felt was more important because it holds 140 million gallons, and you know that really needed to be done, and that was completed, so it took priority. And now we're back to Chestnut Hill. I think we're going to do it with the crews that we have. You know, I know John was on the board. You remember some of the initial costs were quite high.
Yeah.
We feel we can really do this project for a lot less money, and it basically ends up just being an aesthetic situation with a historic reservoir is what we're doing. So we're trying to keep the cost down, make it look nice, but not expend a lot of money on it.
So we're not going to fill the reservoir again?
The reservoir will be filled, but it has an overflow.
Right.
Really the key to it is that reservoir never had an overflow.
Right.
So in the event, and it would have to be a 200-year storm or so, that it toppled over, it has to have, by regulation, it has to have an overflow.
Right.
The problem with that analogy, if you had that type of storm, then probably most of downtown would be underwater already, and it wouldn't matter that the dam toppled over. So what we have to do it, if it's still going to be an earth, you know, dam, then we have to meet regulation to enable to do it. So we went through the process, you know, with the board at the time and also town meeting. That went to town meeting. The vote was to keep the dam.
Yeah, I knew we were going to keep the dam, but I thought we were just going to repair the overflow, and for some reason...
There'll be water back in, and primarily the water, we pumped it down, and there isn't a lot of recovery. Originally, it was blasted out ledge, and there were springs, and then at some point, they sprayed a concrete liner on it, so there's really not a lot of springs that really feed this anymore. So it's primarily rainwater and runoff from snow. Once it's full, it stays fairly full. So there's a little bit of spring water, but not a lot.
Okay. So it is going to go back to the level that it was?
Lower, because it has an overflow, so it can only go so high.
So it is going to be lower.
That's right. Before, what we did is we manually went up and just lowered it.
Exactly.
To keep it at a safe level, but this would be more on automatic.
What's the general cost?
I don't have all the numbers right now. There's currently in the budget. I think we're thinking it was like 100,000 or so.
Okay,
what I'm thinking. But I haven't really refined because you know we're gonna have to bid out some of the products and stuff.
I just wanted to know if we were talking a $500,000 project.
No.
Or $1,000
No,
project.
it was...
We were originally,
It hasn't
we
come
bid
up-
it out.
I've been on the board, this is my 5th year, it hasn't come up with once.
Right.
We had talked about it, though.
That's right.
Like 5 years ago.
Yeah, I have a whole study. And
Right.
it was like 500,000, and it was like I can't see spending that kind of money on what we have. So it's going to be a lot less than that.
Good, all right, thanks.
Water mains. This is used for to upgrade the hydrants in the system, the water mains in the system. We're not asking for any additional funds. I went over the funds that are in these accounts with the finance director, and at this time we feel that we're just stabilizing all those accounts, using the fund balance that's in those accounts.
I know what I wanted to ask. You go ahead first.
Yeah, see, so when the what I read here, when the street's being paved, that's when you go along and check the water mains and see how, you actually dig them up and have a look, or you have something to, I mean, is that how you tell?
We have good records of the water mains that we have. So, for instance, one of the projects in the utilities is Frost Place. We know that the water main needs to be upgraded. We're actually going to clean and line it, which is a process to scrape all the barnacles out of the pipe and line it without digging up the whole street. And then there's another small street down there, Willow Street, that we're going to actually replace the line. So we do that this year, and the street's pretty well deteriorated.
Yeah.
In anticipation of possibly paving that street next year. So we try to get a little bit ahead of the curve, you know, the old adage of you just paved the street, why'd you dig it up? To avoid
Go there and
that.
wreck the street and then come back.
Exactly. So we do, like with the wastewater, we use cameras, and the cameras inspect all the lines, and if there's problems, we either replace it or repair it before we pave. So there is a system to check and make sure that the systems are stable.
The money that's being allocated, or proposed to be allocated, raised $695,000 to replace the water tank on Black Mountain. The plan is not to deplete the running surplus, but rather to maintain the running surplus over the long term, so that we remain healthy with respect to our ability to repay the bonds for the wastewater treatment facility. And so still we can dedicate $700,000 from the money that's raised from water and sewer payments to replace the tank while keeping the running surplus.
There was also,
intact?
there was always an anticipated sum of money that would be expended on capital.
Right.
And John, you can
That's
expand on that.
Yeah. I'd like to speak to that for just a second, because that's correct. And in preparing for tonight, we were looking at the history of that balance and where we are compared to where we had intended to be. And we're actually in a better position now than what we had forecast through the model. But there's some nuances to that I want to further review with John and also Steve, and just make sure that we're fully informed about what that means, where we are compared to where we thought we were going to be, and present that to you at a later date as to whether or not there's any adjustment you want to do as we go forward. But the two bottom line answers for this evening are, we are in better shape than what was originally intended, so we're very secure to spend this money. And the model always did, as Steve just mentioned, anticipate that there would be some continued investment in the capital infrastructure of the facilities while maintaining that healthy balance.
Excellent, thanks.
And there's money that isn't included in the model that is revenue. For instance, when we look at septic, there's another potential $150,000, $175,000 that's coming in that we're not. So, you know, that's another reason that we feel that we could expend that amount of money in the capital for this one project too.
We always anticipated over the course of the last 3-4 years that the revenue from the incoming septic would exceed expectations, but we weren't budgeting for it. That's fair to say?
It starts, I believe it starts to enter the model somewhere.
It is in there.
But it starts to identify revenue in the model now.
Yes.
At what level?
150,000. We have $150,000 in this year's budget, but I think the model has a lesser number than that. I think
like
it's 78,000.
70,000.
Okay. Good.
So isn't this the first year it's starting to show as revenue, or is it last?
Last year.
So it's very conservative, and so that's starting to enter the model there.
And our experience is way better than the conservative numbers in the model?
And
Good.
And connection fees are, we don't know. You know, you could have large connection fees, but we're not going to rely on those for revenue.
Did we ever get around to revising the ordinance to deal with content of the...
We don't have a strength charge.
Of the material that was being put into the system?
No.
That was something we were talking about doing in order to give differential charges to industrial contributors to the system.
Yep.
Is that something we're going to revisit at some point?
I think it's something that, you know, all the ordinances in time, I think we'll need to review those. There's a lot to that discussion. In some cases, there's a justification to not do that, to entice industrial or commercial users to come to our system, which we have quite a bit of. And one of the reasons they came to us is because they didn't have to pay additional charges. So there is a discussion. I think it should be on the table. And there's a lot to it.
Great.
On the other hand, the waste that we do take from commercial or from residential septic tanks is charged at a much higher rate than you as a resident that discharge into the system. It's charged by the gallon, and it's like 7 to 8 cents a gallon. So it's much, much higher for septic that's brought down to the wastewater treatment plant than it is for you as a residential or a commercial user discharging directly into the sewer. And
so we're already charging differential to commercial vendors who are
high strength.
Right.
So there is a high strength when it's treated as a septic, when it's brought and tanked into the facility.
But they bring it in.
They bring
It's
it
not
in.
going through our.
That's right.
truck it
Okay.
in, right?
Yeah,
And you
they're
could-
trucking it in. But we anticipated that.
Right.
That we were going to.
But the chairman's remarks are based on, you know, strength charges for
Right.
people that it costs you more money to treat those waste, whether they have heavy metals or other, or more fats or grease.
Right.
So you have to meet the thresholds that we require, but you could charge more, and some communities do.
But we're still accepting from other areas too. right?
Absolutely, yeah.
That's what we built that for.
Yeah, we're basically all of Windham County and then and part of New Hampshire.
Right.
Water meters, that's another line item that as we replace the meters, they become more efficient. We've done approximately 2,000 out of the 39,900, or there's 3990 meters in town, almost 4,000 customers, and we replaced about half of those. And each time we do the efficiency of those meters, we gain. Normally an old meter that's been in for some time is only 80% efficient. Sewer projects, again, it basically that's to upgrade the sewer mains. It's pretty much we're going to use the existing funds. Vehicles, we're going to be requesting, in this budget, it's requesting to replace one of the compact cars. This board probably has a clear memory of when we first bought these vehicles. It was to replace small pickup trucks, replace it with a high efficiency car. They've been very successful. The warranty has run out on these. They are still mechanically sound and good. We feel to be a good trade-in. There's virtually been no other maintenance besides just oil changes. And that's what this program looks at, is no maintenance, change the oil. When you get to a certain point, when the warranties run out, replace the vehicle, get a higher trade-in for that vehicle, and then purchase another vehicle. And so we feel it's been successful. We know it's saved money in maintenance and then also with fuel consumption. The other one is this Bobcat utility vehicle. That's a vehicle for use down the wastewater treatment plant. Originally, we had talked about taking vehicles and purchasing them in the project itself and adding it to the revolving loan. You know, you buy all the equipment, your tools, your the vehicles and everything. A lot of communities do that when they upgrade their treatment plants. They buy all the equipment and wrap it right into the loan. The board at the time, select board, felt it was more prudent to make these purchases as we went, and so that's why that's in this capital budget. We had purchased our other pumps and tools and equipment as we went along out of our operating budgets. So this would really be the last purchase for that treatment plant. And this vehicle would be a combination vehicle for bringing tools around the facility. As you all know, and you've been down there, the facility is pretty. There's a lot of real estate down there, and in between all the treatment processes, they need to plow the snow so the operators can get to those processes. And there's also the grass, and so this will also unload vehicles. We get, when we do get chemicals, we need an offload vehicle, so that will accommodate that also. So this is a new type of vehicle that we didn't have before, but will serve the purpose of the wastewater treatment. And that's all I have.
Anybody have any questions? So Peter, what's the time frame? This budget's not being presented to us for approval tonight.
We can come back to you if you are comfortable with what's been presented, you have no further information you need from us, we'll come back to you for action on any of the future select board budgets between, select board agendas between now and the 1st of July. It would probably come June 2nd for action, not anticipating that there would be lengthy discussion.
So if we have questions about lines in this one now, you should ask them now.
Yeah, now would be the best time to ask, because if you have questions,
These are just, and mostly they're just clarifications.
if you have questions that we can answer, we want to answer them now, and if you have questions we can't answer, we want to bring that information back to you when there's still plenty of time for approval.
Okay. Then can I do that now?
Please.
Okay.
Now's the time.
On the first page, the general revenues, there are a sale of an asset, miscellaneous income, and interest income that aren't present any other year. They were in our actual last year, but they're not anywhere else. I just wonder what those were, and are you likely to recur?
Anytime we retire an asset or sell an asset, it will show up here. We don't budget for it because we're not really anticipating, selling assets. But when we do trade-in vehicles and things of that nature, that's where that would show up.
I'm just curious, what was it we sold? What was worth 44 grand?
It's probably several things.
Oh, okay. Because again, it's not anywhere else, so now I know why. And then all through here, looking at the actuals compared to what was budgeted last year and what's budgeted for this year, and then going forward, it doesn't seem to be much. There's not a lot of relationship, but it's probably 30 or 40% of the lines where the actuals are really significantly lower than what's being budgeted. And I'm just curious why that is. And I'm wondering if, as one of the, since we're going to be working with this form for a while, that maybe if we had several more years of actuals to compare what's being asked for.
There's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, we don't know how many fires we're going to have. We don't know if it's going to be a dry year. All those are factors into, if we produce and, if you have more fires, then you have to produce more water. If it's dry, people tend to use more water. So these counts are up. They've always been set up as a enterprise account. If the funds aren't needed, they're rolled right back into the utility as a whole. But we've always budgeted them for, worst case scenario. And I guess it is different from how we deal with the general fund, but in the utilities as a whole, that's how we've budgeted, so that we don't know. We just really don't know what the weather's going to be or the water demands. So it's budgeted accordingly, and you'll see that you're right. It's well over 30% of those are higher than the actual. And we don't know the impacts. The other thing that happens with the rate increases, that makes people conserve also. But then over time, then people start, depending on if it's hot weather, you fill in your pools and people get comfortable with the rate that they're paying. So there's just a lot of variables there. Does that help?
Well, it does, and I'm looking at things like maintenance and supply and equipment maintenance and chemicals for wells and electric for wells and things like that just, it's hard to see why emergency repair over time. I mean, emergencies happen, but it's kind of pipe replacement repair. I mean, it seems like there should be averages over time that you could refer to get a more accurate number. And again, as you say, it just goes back in and gets used for something else at some other point. And the same is true with your salt budget or anything else. It's like you use it all up, you get some from somewhere else to make it work. But it doesn't give us a really accurate. It's hard to know what this means when there's, when there's that much disparity.
I understand.
I mean, safety equipment, just, things, lab supplies, chemicals, I mean, they're not weather related or water use related.
They are.
Yeah.
They are, all those things. Everything's right. And one equipment break at the wells could probably cost $25,000, $30,000, $50,000.
So that would show up in next year's actuals.
When things break, they're expensive. They're not, off-the-shelf items. So, but the thing is, if monies or the funds aren't needed, then it's not expended. It just isn't expended. It's turned back in. So, I mean, it's really based on the unknowns.
It's turned back in and then used another time.
Well, that's where the reserve comes in, where this board, you review it every year, and you may decide, that money may be used, like in this example of reserve for the Black Mountain tank.
Right.
Or you may decide. I guess the key would be what the town manager brought up at the beginning when we're looking at the operating budget. It's a 1.6 increase based on rates that were going to be 2.0
is what was forecast. Yeah.
So in operations, we are performing we're trying to keep things as flat as we can.
Yeah, that's not a question at all. I'm just trying to figure out how to rationalize the numbers.
Right.
A couple other things. There's a loan subsidy in 14. Is that like the last payment of the treatment plant? On the first page, John? In grants and donations, there's a loan subsidy.
Yeah, loan subsidy. But one of our loans, one of our bonds has negative interest, and how we treat that as a grant. So that's what that is. It's a loan subsidy or a grant. So it carries an interest rate of -2%, which is, a benefit to the town. It's a grant.
So this is 2% of a really huge loan? It's $2 million.
Oh, that 2.1 million you're looking at?
Yeah.
Those are, there were two bonds that we issued that had forgiveness associated with them. One was a $1.1 million forgiveness, and the other was $1 million. So we took out the two loans or bonds, and we're going to pay back, in one case, $1 million less than we borrowed. In the other case, $1.1 million less.
Can we get more loans
like those?
Yeah. I heard the interest rates were going low.
That was the American Recovery Act.
So does that, and then just at the end, again, this is just because I gradually want to understand this stuff. At the very bottom line, the surplus for 14 is $1.9 million. Is that because we had that 2.1 million extra?
Yes, primarily.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I'd just like to make two additional points on the conversation that you had with Steve regarding the relationship between budgeted numbers and actual numbers. We had a very similar conversation during our administrative review of this before bringing it forward to you, and it was compelling to me the degree to which almost all of those line items that where there's the significant underages for this past year rise and fall together. So I just wanted to underscore that there are a few that are different than that. Yeah. The emergency repairs is a good example. But mostly in those kinds of circumstances that Steve described, whether it's a weather-related situation or a fire-related situation or whatever, we're going to experience the rising and falling of those particular line items, that cluster of line items, together. And so we protect ourselves from that by doing the budgeting in the manner that we do. But the other thing is that it relates also to what I mentioned earlier, that we will have a review that we need to conduct together later in the summer. Once we get these budgets adopted and we get dealing with the other things that are higher priority on our plate right now, we want to come back to you and address where this whole fund is related to expectations, related to the model, related to the rate increase. There are some things going on there that are worthwhile to review, may potentially cause you to decide to tweak where we are with the multi-year rate increases, may decide to stay the course, but as of right now, we're in better position than we had expected to be. We want to explain to you why. In order to do that well, we've got to get ourselves very precisely calibrated as to exactly why and what it means to us. The main point with this is you never want to be caught short. If you're caught short, you're not going to be able to maintain the system properly, and you might have to hit the users with an extraordinary, all of a sudden, unanticipated rate increase. So to the degree that we can just go steady as she goes with the multi-year program that's been adopted, that's in the fund's best interest, the system's best interest, and I think also the user's best interest.
So, Mr. Chairman, can I ask you just one quick thing? You had mentioned a little while ago about, are we adopting this, or are we voting on something? Did I miss something in a meeting, or are we voting on? We're not adopting this yet, are we? Or?
Well, no. So we have, besides the general fund budget, 3 enterprise fund budgets.
Right.
And historically, I think we have begun the review of the enterprise fund budgets a little earlier, like right after town meeting in April, I think.
been all over
Historically,
the- yes.
well,
It's
last 3-4 years, it seems to me that that right away in April we were looking at these utility fund budgets. It may have also been that we needed to spend more time on particularly the utilities fund budget, because we were during 1 year right in the midst of building the plant.
Right.
And then we were still dealing with the rate tool adjusting to the plant being built. And then last year we were dealing with readopting the ordinance.
Right.
So there's been work that had to be done that needed to start earlier. We are now having these 3 budgets presented to us for the first time tonight in the 3rd of our weekly meetings, second meeting in May. And the question is if there's any questions, and if not, we'll be able to wrap it up and bring it on back. Peter says maybe June 2nd.
May I? Yeah, just to amplify that. So we put them on for discussion this evening explicitly because we knew it was your first look.
Right.
And my experience with you so far has been that with items like this, you prefer not to see them and act on them in one evening when you don't need to.
Right.
And you don't need to, because as long as we get adopted before July 1st, we're in good shape.
Yeah.
So our expectation was that this would go about how it has. These are pretty straightforward budgets. There's not a lot of complexity this year compared to when you were building a plan and changing the rates. So if we end up tonight where you're expressing your comfort with these 3 budgets as presented, or with any tweaks that you may indicate, we'll know how to bring it back to you for a quick approval on a subsequent evening.
I just wanted to see if I missed something, that's all.
So that's what I was asking.
Right.
When do we approve this?
Right.
We could have approved it tonight, I guess.
No,
There was no
I'm
questions,
happy
but-
to, you know.
But that's not the way we wanted to present it. I would just note, in response to your inquiry about the difference between the actuals and budgeted, in fact, the budgeted numbers appear to remain very similar year to year to year. And so it looks like in every year, the budgets are being constructed with the same assumptions in mind, and we are running, it seems, the anticipated surplus or deficit as it's been planned. So it's always better to have a budget that reflects actual. So if that needs to be adjusted over time to move closer towards real actual numbers, building in whatever contingency we need, that would be good. But for now, I'm comfortable given that we've got a history of performance and we're running the right numbers in a macro.
Yeah. But David,
presentation.
I can see where it would raise an eyebrow. I mean, if people are out in the audience going, well, geez, now, you know, it'd be nice to always have that little slush, and I agree that we have to have that built in there, but I'm sure people at home are just sitting going, yeah, but geez, that affects us, you know, so.
And that's where your review of the fund balance and the relationship between where we are to where we thought we would be, and any consideration for impact on rates from that's really where that rubber meets the road in terms of any concern that the public or you may have that that the budget isn't tight enough. It's not, at the end of the day, especially in the utilities fund, more so than in the general fund where it affects the setting of a tax rate, because we need an ample balance, it really is about performance. It's always looking year end at where did we end up compared to where we thought we were going to be in terms of funds available, and to make sure that we've got that cushion for capital needs and paying off debt service and so on. And so long as you're staying about where you thought you would be, or a little better, but not a whole lot better to where you're collecting more rates than you need, that's a good place to be. If you start to slide off of that, you're probably not collecting enough in rates because you're losing your cushion. And that's where we get into the situation we talked about a few minutes ago, where you might have to go with a surprise large increase in order to catch up.
Yeah, I think it's just, I understand it completely, and I see that over and over again in all kinds of institutions. That makes sense, and if you're hitting your numbers, that's what you want, if you're within 1%. But what can happen, or what often happens, and what I'm sure we'll watch for, is that things are continually underspent and others are continually overspent. And where you're looking in terms of programming, and you're looking for making sure the money's being spent on the things you want it to be spent on, if you see that pattern over and over again, then it's getting away from your attention. And that's so.
Right.
That's why, that's that concern.
Anything else about the utilities fund budget? I would note that historically the utilities fund budget presentations have been at 7 o'clock in the morning meetings. And so there's usually been no or very little public presentation. We've had members of the press, but certainly not television coverage. So it's nice to be able to do this at night. It provides for a little bit more transparency, just in terms of having it available on TV and having the newspaper and the radio here. So the next item on the agenda is looking at the parking fund and solid waste fund budget. Thank you. I take it Patrick is doing the parking fund budget?
He is. I'd like to just as I did before, I'd like to make a quick overview, and then if you want to dive into details, we can dive into them with Patrick. John. Or John.
John. All right.
Patrick, I think, will have something to say about parking capital, but John will talk about operating. But the bottom line here is less than 1% of increase, $7,000 of increase on a budget that has over $800,000 of annual cost. So once again, I think pretty straightforward. If you have questions about particular line items that are changing, we'd be happy to answer them. I would note, because the scale here is important, unlike utilities where there is a substantial savings in the fuel too, but there's also other costs that are quite large and a much larger scale operation overall. Here, because of the fuel savings and the relatively smaller scale of this enterprise fund budget, that has a huge impact on the percentage increase. So the increase, the percentage increase would be double if the fuel were remaining stable rather than decreasing by so much for this year. But the increase, because it's a less than 1% increase, it would still only be 1.8% increase if the fuel was remaining stable. So all in all, a relatively small budget, very stable operation. I think, it is ready for your approval. Unless you have significant questions about it tonight, we'll bring it back for your approval the next time. But if you want to take a deeper dive in that into line items, then John would be the person to ask.
I guess my only question before we move on to the capital issues, apparently Patrick may be talking to, no increase in meter rates or anything else contemplated this year?
We had not planned to do that. Frankly, I don't know how recently you did that, and if that's something the board would like us to look at, we can.
No, I'm just making sure that we're not raising rates.
No.
We're not raising rates, and so the fund is just going to continue operating even keel.
Correct.
Jan?
Do we want to convene or adjourn as water and sewer
Holy
commissioners?
moly.
Thanks,
We're ready for a motion to adjourn as water and sewer commissioners. We have a motion to adjourn as water and sewer commissioners. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed or abstaining? That carries 4-0 with one member out of the room. Thank you, Jan, for keeping us honest. Maybe we'll sell more smart cards this year. We've been talking about that for as long as I've been on the board.
Right.
You giving them away?
No, people come in and refill them.
Do they?
Lots of people come in and refill them.
Really?
Excellent.
Yeah.
I'm still
promising to buy my wife one, but
I'm still up in the
Come right
air.
across the
I
street
can
and
fill
fill
it
it.
up. Excellent. Patrick,
Yes, sir.
is there something about the parking capital?
Yeah, after some conversations with John O'Connor, one of the things I asked him to take a look at is how much cash is built up into the parking fund and how much could potentially be put to use for capital improvements. Now, as I indicated in the memo, we don't have what I would consider to be a really comprehensive capital plan for the assets in the parking fund. But with that said, I spent some time with Steve Barrett and myself and Carol Colomb, who's a parking enforcement coordinator, and we talked at length about the assets in the parking system. I've summarized them for you here in this particular memo, and they really fall into three basic categories. We've got the Brattleboro Transportation Center, which is our parking garage. We've got a series of surface parking lots, and of course we've got a series of equipment, including the meters themselves, pay boxes, and of course a vehicle used for the collection of meter income. Now, I'll sort of talk about each of them in reverse order. The equipment is in reasonably good shape. We purchased a number of pay boxes last year to phase out some older machines. Director Barrett's vehicle was transferred to the parking fund, and I think it represents a really solid vehicle for the parking enforcement division and will serve it well for several years to come. So at the moment, I'd say equipment needs are in pretty good shape. The surface lots are in a mix of shapes in terms of several of them were repaired or significantly repaved as a consequence of either Tropical Storm Irene or the Union Station project. There are a couple of lots, including the Municipal Center and Spring Street, which are in need of repair, but also may be a location where other capital projects could occur in the next year or so. So they're kind of in a holding position. There are three of the surface parking lots that are in need of some improvement, that being Preston, Harmony, and Harris lot. But perhaps the most important thing that I'd like to draw your attention is, the Brattleboro Transportation Center is a multi-million-dollar building that we own and maintain and operate, one without a very structured capital maintenance plan for the building itself. I think it's something we need to really seriously consider. I think it'd be a worthwhile investment for the investment that we've made into that building. But I did want to draw your attention to one particular need, and I believe I included a picture to help identify why this particular item is of such concern. This is the underside of the stairwell on the eastern side of the parking garage. It's open to the weather, which is by design, but it appears to be a place where excessive salt and water are leading to excessive rust. And so this is a project that I think needs to be scoped out by a professional and developed and sort of brought back to the board for your consideration, along with any other projects we think we are able to successfully put together to utilize this sum that John has indicated is available for capital purchases. It totals $200,000, and what we're anticipating here is to develop these projects that we've identified here into a package that we would bring back to the board in the not too distant future and seek your approval to proceed with.
That makes sense.
Okay.
I just have a quick question on the stairwell.
Yes, sir.
It's only 10 years old. That's troubling.
I agree.
It's troubling that we don't have any recourse with, there's no insurance, there was no, I mean, we can't go back to the builder and say, really, 10 years? I mean, that, to me, that's awful. That's just...
I agree, and I one of the things I also mentioned about that particular building is we don't have a very sophisticated capital maintenance plan for the building. So while we do have a guy, a member of the staff who does building maintenance over there, he could use, I believe, clearer direction for those parts that I think he's being asked to take care of. But then also, I think there are probably service contracts that we probably should have for certain elements in the building that perhaps have been lacking. And a good engineered capital maintenance plan for that specific type of building is something that I suspect is really worth our investment. You know, we've put $9 million into this building. It cost quite a bit to construct. We ought to have a really clear plan for how to maintain it in order to get the most out of that investment.
Does anybody disagree with that concept? So I think we certainly endorse whatever work needs to be done to begin down that road. It's better as soon as the issue is identified to start working on it. And then are there any questions, other sorts of questions about the parking fund budget?
I have a question. It's not as big as the $9 million for the fixing there or whatever, but what's going on with the change machine at the part of the garage? Is that fixed? Because that is a constant source of people coming in saying the change machine doesn't work.
Okay.
And I haven't heard it in a little bit, but that's like the number, it's a little thing, but it's the number one thing I always hear.
And you hear about it specifically related to at the
Parking
transportation center?
Yes.
Yeah, I think, truthfully, I think there is a change machine there which is outdated, it's broken, it's outdated, and it has not been replaced. Perhaps we could reprioritize that into this series of projects.
That's what
Take a look at that.
All the time. Change machine.
Well, that's good feedback.
Yeah.
Thank you. Typically, I hear a lot about the pay boxes, and so, you know, when purchasing pay boxes, we made sure to purchase those that would themselves accept bills, such that a change machine was unnecessary at those locations. But I'll take a closer look at that particular item.
Now, are we ever going to, another thing, again, because I'm located right downtown, I hear this constantly, would there ever be a time where we can accept credit cards, or is that just when something breaks?
You know what? I would love to get us to a point in time where we have what I think might be a luxury at this moment in terms of working on amenities for convenience. We've done some, but I think there is, like in other areas of the town, a great deal of deferred maintenance. I think this picture kind of speaks to that. While John has identified there's $200,000 available, it kind of scares me to think what this project right here could cost.
Saying, like,
but it's certainly on a list of items, you know, because people like convenience items, and you know, particularly moving ahead, I think it'd be great to develop a more comprehensive capital plan for our assets that also include increases and improvements to items of convenience, like taking credit cards at meters and that sort of thing.
Right. I'm only thinking, just like we were talking in the beginning, sometimes if something's broken or something, you get a chance to fix it. Let's look ahead to fix it better. That's what I'm talking about, that with the credit cards, but the change machine seems like we need it now, kind of thing.
We'll take a close look at that.
Any other questions about the parking fund? Excellent. What do you think turnaround will be to try to develop a capital plan? Will we be approving the budget before that?
No, I would think by the time we're approving next year's budget, we will have a more detailed, comprehensive plan. It'll probably take us a couple of weeks to months to put together how we recommend this $200,000 specifically. We're looking at that in next year to act on those.
Cool.
So,
thank you. Anything else about the parking budget?
Just a quick amplification of that. So that the intent of identifying the $200,000 in the budget and proceeding in the manner that Patrick has described is to use these funds exactly in the manner that we asked town meeting to allow us to use the $485,000 for capital needs more broadly. So within the parking fund, this would be $200,000 of money that is available for this type of use that will be included in the budget so that we can, in the months ahead, use it for the highest priority needs, be back to address those highest priority needs with you and use it in that manner while preparing a better long-term plan for the facility.
Excellent.
Can I just ask John one quick thing? How much longer are we paying off on the garage?
I think we have 7
We have
years.
7 years.
7? Okay.
Any other questions or comments? All right, the solid waste, first year.
Again, that's Patrick if you have any specific questions, but that one is identical to what you saw when we were going through the pay-as-you-throw process. It's a very simple little budget, and no changes in the past couple of months. We're just bringing it forward again because we're now giving the formal consideration to the other funds budgets.
And nothing's changed.
And nothing has changed.
And we don't even know yet what actuals may look like.
That's correct.
Because
this is our best
behavior
guess.
could change.
That's right. So we think that one's ready for your adoption. We'll bring it back as part of the package of the 3 for your adoption at the June 2nd meeting. But if you have any additional questions now, we'll try to answer them.
Any questions from anybody? So we have 3 enterprise fund budgets that we've looked at. Is there any further inquiry about any of the enterprise fund budgets? Hearing none. Next matter on the agenda is the Green Street retaining wall. Stephen Hanna, you want to come talk with us about the bad news we got and how we're going to try to respond to it?
The bad news.
It was all bad news last week.
I'll take first stab. If you want to go back into engineering and execution of this, I'm sure Stephen Hanna would be delighted to participate in the conversation. I've got a strong opinion to share with you about where we are. It is a disappointment that we didn't get the structures grant. We thought that the case was compelling even in normal circumstances for this wall, given how the precarious situation we're in, and it continues to lean into the parking lot. It will fail if we don't get to it soon enough, and that window of opportunity is closing down on us.
All right, so Peter, before you go to the next sentence,
yep,
if you would please give the overview, which is we put in 4 grant applications.
Yes.
And we got news back last week. So
yes. So that
make sure that the press hears it and
the
then it's on our Brattleboro.
Okay, sure. So the town applied for 4 grants through VTrans. This Green Street retaining wall was one, Elliott Street Bridge was another, and 2 paving projects. And we didn't receive funding for any of those 4 grant applications. Frankly, Stephen Hanna may want to speak to this from a broader multi-year perspective, but the fact that we didn't get funded for the bridge has some level of disappointment to it. The fact that we didn't get funded for the paving, you know, there's cycles, you get your turn in these things and other people get their turns in these things, and that's not as significant of a disappointment for us. The wall, because of the severely deteriorated condition and emergency that it represents, we thought we would get funded. And then particularly after Secretary Minter's visit here and the question that you asked, Mr. Chairman, about, you know, some consideration from the state for the fact that you know, we've got infrastructure issues we're facing here, some of which, not this wall, but some of which are aggravated by the additional traffic passing through town related to detours in the I-91 project, left us feeling pretty confident that at least the wall would be funded through as one of the 4 applications, and perhaps we might get a second approval as well. We didn't get any of those, and that was very disappointing news. However, back to the focus of this project and this question, this policy decision, I would strongly urge you to stay the course, to authorize us to stay the course on the project, to first of all, I should say also, we've communicated to the CDBG decision makers. Patrick has reached out in support of the grant that we submitted, grant application we submitted for $300,000 for an urgent needs grant through the Community Development Block Grant Program, to let them know of this development and the fact that that urgent need has become even more urgent of a need for the town, that we really must have that $300,000 from them to put together with a couple $100,000 of town funds and get this project done this summer because the wall is failing. And I would suggest to you that if we don't get that fund, those funds, if that grant cycle, which I believe comes to, the decisions on that, the announcement about it will be made in June, so we're getting close, but we're not quite there yet. If we don't receive those funds, then we need to come back and face a tougher situation together over what funds could be made available for this, or is there any way to do something that's an interim approach rather than the permanent fix? What can we do about that situation, since at that point we'd be facing approaching $600,000 worth of town cost with no help from anybody. Given the fact that what we showed you when you were making a decision about which option to pursue included a financial summary that said we're trying for this $157,500 of structures money, we're trying for the $300,000 of urgent need money, but none of that is guaranteed. You know, here's what the component pieces look like. And I believe we even, I don't recall this explicitly, but I feel as though we presented it to you almost in the same way I'm describing it to you tonight, that we knew that these are competitive processes and we very well might not receive both, but so long as we receive the urgent needs, which is the larger chunk, we would be in good shape with the money that was authorized by town meeting, that we could proceed with the option that you had selected for implementation. I still feel that way, and I feel like it's our duty to do something as soon as possible with this wall, because the condition of it after the spring thaw had worsened sufficiently that we've now had to close off a portion of the parking lot below to make sure that people and property are protected from a possible fall. So that's, I think, where we are. What my recommendation to you would be no further action on this evening. Let's see what happens with the $300,000 grant. If we get it, I think we're full steam ahead to implementation. And if we don't get that, then we come back and face the tough Plan B decision.
And are we able to respond immediately once, let's say, good news, we get that grant? We're able to just start right in?
Right. Work has been progressing towards the starting line for construction, and Stephen Hanna can address that.
Yeah, I'd like just get the board up to speed where we're at. The good outline by the town manager. The wall has moved again. We had a survey just completed last week. It shows, if any of you have been up there, or if you haven't, you should go up to Upper Green Street and take a look. There's a crack that goes probably 60, 70, maybe 100 feet, and it's increased by an inch. So that means that we have had some movement. We're also concerned about any increase. We haven't had any rain, so the rain interfiltering into that crack could cause more problems. So we did put jersey barricades for a more permanent support down on the Harmony parking lot to prevent vehicles and cars from getting into that fall zone. As the board recalls, we approved engineering, and the engineering was, I believe it was $30,000 that we got approval up to. We signed a contract with Stevens Engineering here locally for $25,000. To get into the final design, we're talking about $14,000. So we've proceeded with that because we're going to need a final design. We're going to need these extra testing. We're going to need analysis of the wall, as a careful eye on that as we proceed. We've also developed a plan to stabilize this wall so that we don't have a large spill or crack in the wall and then it just collapses and it fails. So what we're proposing to do is actually to hire a contractor. Public Works would be the general contractor. We would hire a contractor, get pricing for an excavator and a dump truck and a crew per hour. We'd seek out estimates from local contractors, hire them by the hour to remove the asphalt, to remove a good portion of the wall down to a level of about 4 feet. So this would prevent, a catastrophic failure of the wall, because that's our big concern. The water main has been shut down at that location, and the hydrant is currently out of service. That's been stabilized. Water valves, as you recall, when we discussed what preventative actions we were taking last fall, we had installed water valves so we could isolate that if the situation got worse. It did get worse. The water main's been shut off. So now we're looking at hiring a contractor, and I think we can do that quite reasonably. And still, you know, this money isn't bad money after good, because, or good money after bad, because this part of the project would have to be done anyways. We've met with Green Mountain Power. There is a utility pole, a very important utility pole that feeds all the Brooks House and the Harmony parking lot. That needs to be stabilized during this project. We feel we have a decent plan for that. So when the wall is taken down, the road is sloped, that pole will be held, and then there'll be a cement buttress that's put in to stabilize that pole so that we can proceed with building the wall. So there's a lot of moving parts here, but I still feel good that we got pretty close to a final design. We have some alternatives still to look at, depending on how this wall comes apart. So that's our next step. So we still, at this point, our investment, you know, we do have funds to take care of stabilization and the final design and the bid documents. And when we get to the next point, I think that timing will match up with the grant that we're hoping to receive funds for. And then we'll have a better idea of what the cost was, because we could proceed with a bid, or we'll have to make that decision with the town manager and the board. You know, what do you want to do in steps? So that's an update of where we're at today. Hannah, do you have things you want to add?
The other benefit to doing a temporary stabilization like this is it gives us a good idea of what's going on back there. And although we've done test borings, in all reality, they only tell us what's going on in space about this big around in 6 different locations around that job. So by doing some excavation back there, gives us an opportunity to see what kind of soils are really back there, and, you know, confirm that everything we know up to this point is still a good path to move forward.
That's a great point, because it also will make a determination on the height of the wall. So if the soils are unstable, then the wall may have to go deeper with its footing. Quite a bit deeper, actually. So that's a huge factor. As Hannah said, when they excavate this area, they'll have a better idea of how solid those soils are when they pour this buttress for the telephone pole, so that it could cut the cost on the total amount of materials and time with the wall if we don't have to go to a deeper depth. So, good point.
John?
Yeah, I don't think we can afford to wait. You know, this is just one of those situations where, you know, it's wonderful if we get the money, but I'm all for saying we need to move quickly on this, because if it does fail, you know, if we got a heavy rain, you know, I was up there the other day. It's an amazing crack, and if that fills up with water, I mean, that could go at any point now. So, you know, it's all well and good whether we get the money or we don't get the money, but, you know, the state of Vermont is in this, you know, they don't have any money, you know, so we're playing that shell game all the time, whether we get grants or not. This is one case where, at least I feel that it's very, very necessary to get this thing going and not delay it because we don't know whether we're going to get money or not.
Well, again, in discussing this with the town manager, we agree, and that's why we're proceeding with the final design and the stabilization element of this project, which, you know, we'd have to do anyways. But then we'll be prepared to come back to the board also if we put this out to bid. The board can re-examine the numbers, and then I think the timing will be close to when we would know about other available funds.
Yeah.
So,
Don?
Just a question, have there been projects of this size and scope in Brattleboro in your history with the town that we have successfully done in stages? And how has that gone?
Well, one comparable wall, which was much larger, is Canal Street between Elm Street and towards Main Street. That's probably 4 or 5 times the length if you look at that wall, and it's the same type, similar construction that's going to happen. It didn't happen. It wasn't phased in. It was done all at once. This particular wall, after the analysis has been completed by the engineers, there's larger section of this wall that we're not going to address. So we are essentially doing this in sections. If you take it from Reading Place to the Bass Building, that's the scope of where this project is going to take place. there's still a retaining wall going towards High Street
Right.
that's still in existence, but it's in fairly good shape, but we're not going to address that with this project, so we are phasing it. I'm sure, I can't think of any other projects that, you know, where we've done portions of right off the top of my head, but I know that Canal Street is one good example, because on the other side, we didn't address it behind the market or any of that area.
Right.
Hannah, did you have something you could add there?
I just wanted to comment on one thing that John said in terms of the timeliness and getting started. One thing in terms of moving forward without having the ACCD grant in hand is that certain funding agencies require that you go through a formal bidding process that meets their specifications, or so we can't,
Right.
you know, at the risk of jeopardizing that, even if they said, yep, you're guaranteed to get that money, you know, it wouldn't be in our best interest to. They typically won't fund something that's been out to bid
Right.
prior to actually.
Where do we put public safety ahead of you know, getting a lawsuit as opposed to waiting for $150,000?
There's two things there. One is that Stephen had noticed that the condition of the wall is in worse shape this spring than it was last fall, and came to me immediately to report that and had a plan, and it's what Steve has described this evening. And we believe that's the appropriate aggressive action to reduce the risk of a failure that would dramatically fall into the lot and be, you know, catastrophic is a good word for it. It also, by doing that as an interim step, as he's described, it doesn't add cost to the project. It adds a little bit of complexity, but in a way that we can manage to the project by doing it with a safing it up phase and then the big construction phase.
Yeah. Yep.
And because $300,000, the balancing factor there. So the first thing is public safety is paramount, and that's why we would address this differently from how we had described a couple of months ago to you with this first piece of work that is all about public safety. It's all about removing structure in an effort to prevent any kind of a failure, but if there was failure, reducing that to something that will pose a much less threat to the public. That's number one. Number two is the balancing factor is $300,000 is a very large grant. It would pay for more than half of the construction of this project. And so we thought, you know, it takes a certain amount of time to get the project final design done and get out to bid anyway. And especially with this effort that is going forward to safe it up, we're on a critical path where it makes all the sense in the world to align the way forward for the construction project with the grant process. And then we'll know for sure whether we have to come up with that additional $300,000 or whether we're going to receive it. I hate to say these words out loud, but I will say, especially under the terms of the urgent need program, you know, we were feeling pretty confident about this 157.5 from VTrans, and it didn't materialize. But we feel optimistic about the $300,000 urgent need grant, and that's a lot of money to leave on the table for just a few weeks.
Right. Well, I'm just glad that the process, you know, the minimizing it, you know, is happening.
Good.
Yeah.
David?
This is kind of I'm glad you're going to stabilize, you know, dig the asphalt out and take the stone out. Where does the stone go?
We have the first refusal on the stone. So we've talked to some of the stone masons, and that particular stone isn't as desirable because it is soft and you can see evidence where it's cracking. But there's a value. Well, there's still a value there. So we've reserved the right to hold the value of the stone. So in this process, they're going to remove the stone, and it'll either be stockpiled, or there'll be a value that we'll get reimbursed for. And we just started the investigation on that today, but we did reserve the right to keep the stone.
Well, when you bring the Bobcat up, he'd like to bring
what's the stone?
That's where he's going with this.
Go to tear my deck off so I can build it. But the other question is about the VTrans money. There were 4 projects that didn't get funded, and we've got the municipal center project here too, all of which are now going to be coming out of the money that's approved it. town meeting. And, well, I guess, let me go on.
Yeah.
What I'm thinking is that
My comments on that.
the 157.5 that we didn't get is going to have to come from someplace else. And so what, at this point, what are you anticipating isn't going to get done? Because we're clearly not going to have enough money to do all the things that when we said, let's do this project, and if we didn't get the 157, we could get it from other places, so we'd be fine. But we didn't get any of those VTrans grants. So I'm wondering, is that assessment still as valid now as it was then? And what aren't we going to be able to get? Like, are we going to have to wait longer for the Elliott Street Bridge or some other project to get?
The Elliott Street Bridge, as you know, is behind in terms of timeline. It is behind the other projects and also has less urgency. It's not to say it's yeah. I mean, it is functional the way it is. Obviously, it's not something we can leave in that condition. But of the 4 items that could potentially have been funded with using the $485,000 authorized at town meeting, that was the lowest priority of the 4. It's the one that won't get done with using that $485,000 in all likelihood. But this Green Street wall is the highest priority. We've taken care of the Union Street, Western Avenue intersection differently. And we got a favorable bid for what it's worth as the first, action out of the box on this building. So there is more work obviously to be done here. It would be good if we can accomplish the additional retaining wall work in a way that leaves some money for the municipal center. That's all part of what will flow out of this sequence of events. So we'll find out about the CDBG grant. We'll do what we need to do related to this wall. We'll be bringing you later this summer the plan for how to approach phase 2 and phase 3 of the life safety improvements in this building. We'll utilize more of that 485 if we can, but if it has had to be diverted to this wall project instead, we'll have a different plan to offer you at that time.
Well, that's kind of, I think when Donna, I hadn't thought about this, when Donna mentioned stages, it struck me that if we can, I mean, the urgency of Green Street is the danger of it collapsing.
Right.
It's not an urgency for traffic flow that's ruining your downtown businesses or anything like that. And I'm not sure that in the minds of the public, if it's as urgent as the Elliott Street Bridge is. So I think if we get the 300,000, then we can, we can talk about what is possible. If we don't get the 300,000, and even I think even if we get it, I think we should revisit once it's stabilized and we see what's over there and what remains to be done. I think we should revisit the conversation about which of these things get done. So anyway, I would like to do that at least, and not just the 300,000 goes ahead. So okay, we're going to toss toss another 200,000 into it and put the road back through. I'd rather we have a conversation about all the other things that need to be done. If that could be, maybe we should do the Elliott Street Bridge now and leave that and try and do that next year with some money, or try and set some of the 400 or the money that was approved by town meeting aside and ask for some more at the next town meeting to finish the Green Street wall instead of just chunking it in as a priority. Because I mean, as I've said in the previous meeting, we talked about this. I really don't see it as a priority, and park would be much preferable to me. But again, I think we should probably get a wider range of opinions. We have a public hearing to get a sense of how important people think that road through is. If we're going to spend up 1% of our budget, really $150,000. If it's more important than Elliott Street, or is it important enough to even do for 1%? I think it's all. Our budget's 15 million, so 150,000 is 1%.
So I'm just wondering that if once you apply for a grant, isn't that job specific?
If we get the 300,000.
Yeah. I want to note that I think we have continued to act with all deliberate speed and haste in moving forward with making repairs to that Green Street retaining wall. The rejection of the grant application for urgent needs that would have been applied to that wall
only came last week. All the work has been unfolding in the same manner that we had previously contemplated and we previously authorized administration to be pursuing. When I heard last week that all 4 grants had been rejected, grant applications had been rejected, I suggested that we put it right on the agenda for this week's meeting because this is an urgent need. I think we have to remember in broad scope that there's a lot of capital needs. There's the 4 that were approved to be dealt with the $485,000 in surplus money that town meeting approved for us to use. But besides the Green Street Wall, besides Union Hill, and the work that needed to happen there after that hit and run that resulted in a fatality, in addition to the fire suppression systems and other safety work needed at Town Hall, besides the hole in the Elliott Street Bridge, we also have to remember that we've got a failing retaining wall at Bonnievale Road that has to be dealt with, and that there are Jersey barriers up there at this point because there's a failing wall there. We still have the outflow pipe on Harris Place that potentially is undermining the integrity of the railroad tracks there that we're going to have to tend to. And we've got all the serious life safety issues at the police and fire facilities that haven't been dealt with yet. So I don't disagree that we need to look at all these things together and prioritize them as a whole. I do think that we need to see if the money's coming in the next month. I'm not clear that we can have the discussion before the money comes in or not. But I also think that the board made a commitment to doing the Green Street Wall, and we certainly can reconsider it and see if there's a different view from the board as a whole. But the board as a whole voted just 6 weeks ago, I think it was, to commit to rebuilding that wall. And we'll put everything back on the agenda for a broad discussion about it. But at this point, I don't think that there's any message that should be coming from Select Board to administration that we're not planning to do that wall. I mean,
I agree with that. I think the $157,000 is a material change in the situation. But I agree. No, that's why, and I'm glad the plan is to make it safe. Right. And then we do have some options, and we're not having to worry about what to do next. We've got time to consider.
And so this meeting started at 5:30 and we're now at 7:30, 2 hours in. And our goal was to do the zoning part at around 6:30 so that this wasn't going to be a 3 or 4 hour meeting. And each issue that we've dealt with has been full discussion and important to deal with. And this is why we're having meetings every week. And is there any more for discussion about Green Street retaining wall?
Rod, can you shorten it up?
Any more discussion about Green Street retaining wall? All right, so we'll look forward to hearing back as soon as we can about the CDBG grant. Yes, ma'am. Well, that's the rate tool. That's the rate tool. Can we turn off the rate tool? Well, they're going to go back to the planning thing.
No one can read it anyway.
All right. And I'm now going to call the next item on the agenda, which is the tiny grant program. And I'm going to say we plan to have only a tiny bit of discussion about the tiny grant program. Does somebody want to just make a motion?
I move the tiny grant.
I mean, I understand. Tiny grant program, is there a motion we have to make?
Just authorize us to apply.
All right. I move to approve application for a $500 tiny grant from the Association of Vermont Conservation Commissions. Is there any discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Anybody opposed? That carries 5-0. Greetings to the Planning Commissioner and Planning Department staff.
Hello.
Good evening.
How are you?
Still before my bedtime, but not by much.
Not by much.
I hear ya. So tonight we're presenting on protecting rural character while planning for growth. And we're going to focus on the rural part of Brattleboro, which we consider to be the rural and the rural residential zoning districts. And then we're going to finish it with talking about some of the resource protection standards that will apply generally within the regulations. So.
I'm not saying anything, but you just lost everybody.
Oh, no, you can,
Don't know what to say about that.
But you have our undivided attention.
And
this
I
is
will
not showing
note,
me.
because I read Brattleboro last Wednesday, that Brattleboro is watching, and we know you're watching.
And 200 people read it.
Why is
Closer to 100.
Why is it zoomed in?
Rod,
We want
It's supposed to be a full
Sue,
map.
Elizabeth, how are you?
Sorry if you felt neglected.
Good to see you.
There we go.
I just am the member of the public here tonight.
No, planning commissioner.
So we have the proposed zoning map up again. So the parts of town that we're talking about for the first part is the dark green, which is the rural zoning district, which is almost about half of the town, and the lighter green, which is called the rural residential zoning district. And there's a slight boundary change to these areas. So if you go up Meadowbrook and Pleasant Valley, where kind of Rod has what are those called?
The highlighter.
The highlighter. Previously, I may have mentioned this at the last meeting. On the western side of those roads, it went about a parcel. There were some small parcels on the road, and it kind of cut back that distance, maybe an acre from the road. I can't remember the exact distance. And so we've kind of snapped the zoning district boundaries to the road lines. And so that's both for Meadowbrook, Pleasant Valley, and then going down Bonnievale and Miller Road.
Right.
And then the only other change is there is some land.
Wait, Pleasant Valley Road? I would think Pleasant Valley Road is just entirely
It was not.
rural. Now?
No. There is, a certain distance from the road that was not.
But now it's going to be.
We're proposing it to be entirely
We
in the
propose to fix that.
So
for
now
the
they're
west side of the
divided?
road.
Yes.
So the west side of Pleasant Valley and Meadowbrook.
About an acre. The parcels were split, so the road frontage on both the west and eastern sides is currently rural residential, and we are proposing to shift the line to the road so that everything on the western side of the road is in rural, not half the parcel or less than half the parcel in rural.
And everything on the east side of the road is rural residential?
Yeah.
Yes. So the road becomes the dividing line between the two districts. You see what it was? Right.
I understand.
Yeah. Okay. You're just a bit surprised. 'Cause,
No, I'm thinking about,
okay.
there's no difference in the character on one side of the road and the other, particularly Pleasant Valley.
Right. That's true. But
I mean, I would think that Pleasant Valley Road would all be rural.
Other than needing a definition,
right.
a point.
From an administrative standpoint and from a property owner standpoint,
It probably is.
every now and again you encounter this issue where somebody's proposing to do something on their land and it's in two zoning districts. And so wherever possible, we try to avoid that because it's just more complication. And this is one of those examples. Yeah. Okay. So we were talking about this area.
Oh, just to the east of 91, right there.
Yeah.
So that had previously been in the residential zoning district. We've moved it into the rural residential. A lot of that is conserved land that is restricted from development. And I think that there is some off of Upper Dummerston that would, still be available, but the Upper Dummerston, I think, was rural residential anyway. So.
Right.
But there was a couple parcels in there, owned by Wyndham Foundation, I think. The minimum lot size in these zoning districts is not changing. So in the rural residential, it's 1 unit per 1.5 acres, and in the rural, it's 1 unit per 3 acres. And these are just some examples.
Do you want to zoom in?
No, that's okay. The photo on the left and on the top, those are in the rural district. The bottom one is in the rural residential zoning district. And I think, between the bottom and the top photo, there isn't a lot of difference in character. David, I would agree. They're different parts. One is Route 9, the other is the PUD.
This one down here?
Yeah. John O'Connor's neighborhood. Sorry.
Hillwinds North.
Hillwinds North, sorry about that. But what strikes me, I think, when you're driving through the rural parts of town is there's a lot of green space, and I think that's reflected in these pictures. So, and in terms of uses, it's primarily residential uses. There are some non-residential uses allowed that may be, bed and breakfasts, inns, even a conference structure, nurseries, kennels, that are kind of related to the rural lands and how you might use them. So that's a quick overview of those zoning districts.
So what we heard back at the town plan process phase was that the outreach that we conducted was led us to the conclusion that for the community, agriculture is regarded as very important, and it's important for us to maintain large enough parcels for agricultural activity to be viable. So it's in a way kind of a bookend to the last presentation where we were concerned about making sure that there is enough industrial land and it is also zoned so that the minimum parcel size protects genuine industrial uses. So it's one of those matching of the regulations with people's aspirations and expectations. The other thing that comes from ensuring working landscapes and plenty of open space is the preservation of wildlife corridors by minimizing development in those corridors. So there's actually, it's too bad that Howard has left, there was a somewhat tongue-in-cheek comment from Bob Audette in the Reformer yesterday about Outside Magazine nominating Brattleboro as one of its top towns, and pointing to what was, in Bob's mind at least, largely the urban character of Brattleboro rather than its outdoorsiness. But when we did our work on the town plan, we encountered people having really strong connections to the land for recreation uses and to enjoy the natural environment. And for a town its size, it's really rich with those opportunities, and there's a large number of not-for-profit and private organizations that are here to steward the landscape in that way, including the Outing Club and the Wyndham Foundation. So we think that by making these important adjustments to the land use regulations, we're going to maximize those natural, environmental, and recreational opportunity assets, which is an important building block coming from the town plan process. To further our work, we actually received some support from the EPA back in 2013. And that's when we began, as soon as the town plan was adopted, we turned our attention to the subdivision process and subdivision regulations and began to think through ways in which we could make these changes. A lot of the work that we did with the EPA, it was a series of workshops, and identified steep slopes as a concern, sensitive natural areas as a concern, and the need to have this information inform the site plan process and development proposals, and then also to focus on legal and design tools that are able to enhance the assets that we've identified. So an example of a legal tool would be the process of placing land in current use or a conservation easement, and the design tools that we're speaking of are really what we're going to portray here and in subsequent presentations, where we're talking about introducing design standards for subdivisions that respond to these natural conditions or hazardous conditions. So what we want to do now is shift gears a little and start talking about modes of development, and Sue's going to lead off talking about rural subdivisions, which we are in this proposal thinking of as a process that is specific to the rural and rural residential areas of town and has some certain steps and procedures involved in it. So, Sue.
Okay. First of all, for subdivision of land that would occur in the rural or the rural residential zoning district, there's essentially two options. There's a conventional approach where we're going to determine the lot yield, so the number of parcels that you're going to be able to get based on a developable area and a density factor. So this is one way it kind of, right now our subdivision process is if you have 12 acres and you're in the rural zoning district, you can get 1 unit for every 3 acres, so you get 4. You can conceivably subdivide your land to get 4 parcels out of it. And we're going to switch that up a little bit, and I'll walk through that. And then we have the conservation PUD, which is another approach where you, in exchange for setting aside open space, which would be 60% of the parcel would be open space, we're going to allow you to calculate the number of lots you get based on the entire parcel. So we're not going to start looking at what's developable and what's not. Again, we'll walk through that. I would say there is one exception. So if you are doing a subdivision of 5 or more lots in the rural zoning district, then it would need to be a conservation subdivision because we really want to work on protecting some open space. But if you were doing 5 acres or more in the rural residential, you could still choose. Both types of subdivision are going to allow for clustering on smaller lots than what the minimum lot size is in that zoning district. So, you know, the picture under the conventional subdivision kind of shows maybe each of those parcels is 1.5 acres, and you get your road frontage, and that's typically the way the land gets subdivided. And we're hoping to enable smaller lots, smaller frontage, in exchange kind of for clustering it and looking at the landscape a little bit more. And I'm going to talk briefly about what developable area is and what density factor is and why we're moving in this direction. So in any subdivision, there's land that can't be developed. It's either too steep, it's wet, it's going to be used for your roads. And so as a way to respect kind of the true carrying capacity of the land and to give applicants a true representation for what they can reasonably expect to develop, we've decided to use a developable area calculation. And this takes the total acreage and subtracts the following features: surface water, wetlands and buffer areas, or wetlands and their buffers, riparian areas, which we're going to discuss in a little bit, and slopes that are greater than 30%. And then, if you go on to the next slide. So this is kind of an example. Here, first we'll go through the developable area. So this parcel has 50 acres. There's 10 acres of steep slopes. There's 10 acre of riparian area. And so we're going to subtract that, and we're going to end up with 30 acres that are deemed to be developable. And then we're going to apply a density factor. So if you're in the rural district, it's going to be 3, so 1 unit per 3 acres. So in this example, you would get 10 lots. If you're in the rural residential, we're going to use the 1.5 acres. If your only access to the parcel is on a Class 4 road, the density factor is going to be 12 because we really don't want to encourage development on Class 4 roads. We don't have too many in town, but the idea here is if there's more development, then they might be looking for the town to come and improve that road. I think we've seen a little bit of that over the years. It also, Class 12 or Class 4 roads, the town doesn't need to maintain them, so emergency access and those kind of services, you know, gets a little could be tricky if it's not in good condition, not maintained in good condition. So the rest of this example shows the density factor. This is a parcel on a Class 3 town road in the rural zoning district. So this, under a conventional subdivision, could get 10 lots. And then, before you leave that, if you could just go back. So the way that we're going to work through that with applicants is we are going to require a pre-application conference where the applicant would come into the planning department and they would meet with Rod or I or both of us. And we would go over the GIS information that we have. The surface waters is really great information. The slope information is getting better all the time. The state is even flying LiDAR, so it's going to be more accurate. If the applicant wants to hire a professional to make these determinations, they can do so, but they don't need to. We'll provide the information. And then in the end, when they're before the DRB will kind of confirm that they agree with the information. So that's how we'll help applicants with that. And at this pre-application conference, it would also be an opportunity to kind of go through the design process of how you would lay out the subdivision. So some of these sketches that you're seeing are actually from the proposed land use regulations. This is one of them. And so it's used to illustrate the design process that we would like to see for the rural and rural residential zoning districts. And the purpose is to get the applicant to better fit the development into the landscape, to maximize the protection of important natural and cultural amenities and maintain the character of the community. So most of the subdivisions we see, again, are chopped up, are parcels along the road, and maybe they meet the frontage and they go back a distance, but really what that's doing is fragmenting the open space. So we'd like a little more thoughtful consideration of what is on the land and give them the flexibility to lay it out in a different way. So first, the applicant would submit a site analysis, and it's an assessment of the natural resources and even the cultural resources that might be on site. And so here's some examples. There's streams, there's forest blocks that maybe go off the parcel. Maybe there's hay fields. Maybe there's primary ag soils, and we can help provide a lot of this information. And so this is kind of the level of detail we'd be looking at. It's not something an engineer necessarily needs to do, unless they're using an engineer for the subdivision. And then the next step in the process, on the right-hand side, would be to determine what areas might you want to locate the development. So in this example, they chose the one that Rod has highlighted. And then in the next, you would actually lay out the subdivision. So this goes back to that other example. So you could get 10 acres. At this point, the applicants are just choosing to build 4, and then there could be 6 more lots in the future. And these lots are all, we allow in the regulations to the minimum lot size to be 20,000 square feet. So that's very different than having the 3 acres. So these can be smaller lots. Now there's some challenges with that, because if you need a septic and a well, you're probably going to need more than 20,000 square feet, but you don't necessarily need 3 acres. And then you can also reduce the lot frontage to 150 feet. So again, much smaller lots. And the benefits to the community are lower impact to water quality and natural environment, ability to retain significant local features and views, and then reduced infrastructure and reduced maintenance costs. The benefits to the developer are the potential to reduce infrastructure costs as they develop, the flexibility to develop in a way that avoids costly and difficult to build areas, and if you go the PUD route, a density bonus would allow for more units to be built. So.
Okay, so picking up on the PUD approach.
Can I inquire?
Sure.
My sense is that this is a different way of going about determining how subdivisions can occur.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been years since I was on the zoning board, development review board, but it feels like a very different approach. And based upon the meeting I attended, I expect this is going to be front and center in developer sites in terms of saying that this is too complicated and this restricts developers and landowners' ability to use their land. And I'm wondering what your response to that is. I know you went through, Sue, a number of benefits to developers, but certainly they're not going to see it that way.
Yeah.
We think
certainly
likely. We think it's an education process primarily. The one thing we'd say is, going back to the source document here, which is the town plan, is at the level of the. Let me just sort of jump out here and go back to here. So when we talked about fully 2/3 of the town being occupied by this really bright spring green or this slightly darker green. This is rural residential and this is rural. Area-wise, this is vast. What we've attempted to do is direct and intensify a range of development inside this area here, so east of the 91 corridor, with some important and significant exceptions. So that's the Route 9 corridor along here, taking in West Brattleboro Village, and then the area further west. So these areas here are already built up and already have a relatively high density population for communities such as ours in Vermont, and in particular down in the traditional inner neighborhoods, the population density and the housing density is extremely high. So the idea here is, once you've recognized this whole area through here as a significant asset, what is the best regulatory tool for making sure that we can preserve that asset in the long term? What we don't have in this presentation is photos showing a series of houses built from next to this here, dating from, this one looks like it's the early 1900s, but if this was, say, Route 30 or an area such as that heading north out of town, it's a string of family homes roughly from this era all the way through to the 1970s or even the 1980s, strung out along a sealed road with a school bus on it and good services, which if you go back to the map here, you'll notice along all these all these roads that we spoke of, Bonnie Vale and so forth, that's the pattern of development. What we're trying to do is turn a page here and say, if you want to make a substantial development in either rural residential or rural of 5 housing units or more, we want you to attend to these questions that we've presented here. And we think that there's enough room and enough information for you to do that. There's some upfront planning costs. Our department, our office is able to provide a lot of that basic information. We think a lot of this information is literally free. It's something that you could access either through the state atlas, Natural Resources Atlas, or even Google Earth. There's enough information. You don't have to be a professional developer to want to engage in a 5 parcel subdivision, and you don't need access to their professional information to do that. What we would say is that you're confronted with a set of choices about how you want to go about doing this. If you want to do a conventional subdivision, such as this one here, then it's going to have to be 5 parcels or fewer, which we think, even in the instance of somebody who's currently holding a large-ish farm and has family members that they would like to carve off reasonable sized parcels for, that accommodates that inheritance function. And we think that for the most part those developments are usually done pretty sensitively because those people are connected with the land. So what we've tried to do is say, if this is a larger venture with significant consequences, we've got a mode that we would prefer you to follow. And
yeah, sorry. It actually is codifying a common sense approach to a large parcel that most people would do anyway, in terms of not building on steep slopes, not building along the rivers and streams and so forth, and allowing open space. So it's, from the developer's perspective, they're getting a better product in terms of a nicer subdivision, which is more valuable. And at the same time, when they use the open space, you know, they get a bonus in terms of the smaller lot size. So it's really what a developer would do anyway, but it's codifying it through the zoning so that they can take advantage. We can get the advantage of a nice subdivision. They get the advantage of a nice subdivision as well.
And I would say developable area is new to Brattleboro if this was implemented, but it's not uncommon. There are lots of New England states. There's a handful of communities in Vermont that actually do subtract developable, or the land that's not developable from that calculation. So it's new, would be new here, but we had, when we were working on the subdivision regulations, we had a professionals breakfast, and we did have a local surveyor that came and said, oh yeah, they do that all over the place and here and there. So it wasn't new in that respect. And then the lot yield, I think that is probably a newer, or putting a density factor, that's a newer tool. But there are communities in Vermont that use it. Norwich is one of them, and they actually have, we kind of set it at the zoning district density unless it was on a class 4 road. They do something different, but there are communities that are exploring different ways of doing subdivision, because the model that we're probably operating now, which is out of Ohio from the 1980s, is not Vermont. And and if you look at a map too, I mean, we've done some work to figure out the, we've looked at some subdivisions, we've used the developable area calculation and the lot yield, and we're pretty close to actually what was subdivided, the number of lots that were subdivided.
Yeah, I mean, we're getting, it's not, in other words, to put that differently, this is not a lot more restrictive in terms of the total outcome. The steps that you take to get there involve some demonstration that the impact isn't going to be significant, and that you're responding to identified values in the regulatory toolbox. So I think even from the cost standpoint, when professionals are approached by large landowners, I'm talking over 100 acres, and the professionals are asked to assess what the carrying capacity of that land is if it's going to be developed as a residential subdivision, then they look at exactly these features. They're taking into account the steepness of the slopes, because that's going to affect the cost of any road that's pushed in, and power. If they're looking, when they look for wetlands and streams, they're looking for permitting issues and areas of land that under no circumstances will they be able to develop anyway, because they'll require an A&R permit through the Act 250 process. So we're bringing together a lot of information, and we're requiring them to respond to a lot of things. But in our experience, watching what professionals develop as background information so that a property owner can decide whether they want to pursue a subdivision or not, this is exactly the information that they pull together. So we don't feel like it's even an extra cost in that sense. It's that they're sharing information that they've already had to pull together.
But doesn't our topography anyways dictate? I mean,
yes, I think that's fair.
We don't have a lot of Willistons and a lot of...
Right.
We don't have a whole lot of flat land.
We don't have a lot of flat land,
so yes, actually, to go back to this point here, if we were able to overlay this map with the steep slopes map,
it'd be all over the place.
One of the explanations as to why this looks the way it does is that it's already difficult to build there. That's why people haven't, built there.
And in a sense, by loosening up, allowing smaller lot sizes and allowing it to be clustered, we could potentially be giving them more of an opportunity to develop than what exists, because it's a crazy map.
That's what I'm wondering is, along with David, what was David saying, are we kicking ourselves here a little bit by adding more restrictions, or because as you guys so eloquently put it, it makes it sound like it's just going to be wonderful for developers. But I think in reality, they may balk at this.
Well, I've worked for developers for 30 years, and this is exactly what they do when they're looking at a large parcel of land. Right. And they're sophisticated enough to deal with it, and they know that this is, the best way to get the environmental benefits as well as the yield that they want. Mm-hmm. I mean, it has both sides of the equation. Good for the town, right. Good for them.
And what I'd say there is all the easy parcels are pretty much done.
Are done.
Mm-hmm. And so there's an important realization with that.
Right.
Any further development in those areas that we identified out here are either going to be small and related to the existing owners and the existing uses, the conventional small subdivision that we spoke of, or it's going to be somebody who is willing to take on that task of and the complexity of a larger scale project. And there are other commitments and there are other costs associated with that are going to be far greater than this stage of the planning process. Some other things have happened, including changes in the way we deliver and make electricity, and particularly the way we deal with wastewater. So in the 1980s, when we got the subdivision regulations that we have now, the state had this requirement that only once you were, once your parcel was more than 10 acres, 10.1, you didn't need a wastewater permit. You'll remember that phase. There's a colloquial way of saying that I'm not going to say. So that went away.
Goes downhill.
Yeah. So that went away in the mid-2000s, and our subdivision regulations haven't responded to the change. So there are modern, complex septic systems that are designed for installation on steep slopes and in other difficult areas. So the state's wastewater permitting program has updated, but our subdivision regulations haven't. So we actually think that there is land out here that is available for development using contemporary wastewater management techniques and other techniques that that our regulations are not responsive to. So this is a way of updating our regulations so that they're in keeping with the newer state requirements. Under those circumstances, there is a give and take. There's a balancing act going on here. So if we do open up more land for development, then what are the physical constraints that we want to have recognized in doing that? And we think we're at that point fairly closely now, where there's not a lot of easily developed land left. And so the appropriate response is to mix modern technical solutions with a modern assessment of what the carrying capacity of the land is going to be. So, I mean, that would be our explanation for the development community also.
And by the way,
will we hear from the development community?
Oh, soon.
The
public hearings happen.
Okay.
Yeah.
and in terms of modern, carrying capacity concept is from the 1950s. So we're catching up
to the
a tremendous amount
Yep.
in 2015.
Right.
And so this, again, should be no surprise to any developer because this is the way things work.
We'll see.
Okay, so are you okay? You want to move on, or you're right?
Right, I have a hunch this is not going to finish in a timely manner either tonight.
We're almost done.
Are we?
Yeah.
We're going to go faster now.
We're about 5 minutes.
You don't know yet that we have to have executive session after this.
Yeah, don't get too excited.
I didn't know that.
I was going to start passing notes to the other side of the table, but
And I know you had a chance to
There's
meet
talking, but there's an educational component to this that I feel like is really responsible. And it really does go towards keeping Vermont and our community particularly lovely. So,
and we have to make a decision on things that we don't know we don't know much about, so we rely on you. But on the other hand, I know that you're presenting this model from your perspective, and the two or maybe three things I've heard not from you about this are more just they're seeing red tape and seeing regulations that are going to frustrate development. So that's so I want to know as much as I can. I want you to just drone on for hours.
We won't do that.
We're happy to talk about it any time that works for you outside this meeting room too. So planned unit developments have been around at least since the 1960s, possibly earlier. And so this is a regulatory process that is used across the world to find ways to facilitate developers using their imagination and responding to the physical arrangement of the land to come up with a more efficient and more effective use of that land that is also likely to provide them with a better profit and a more significant margin. But while achieving that, also providing people with a kind of housing or other buildings arranged in a way that works for them. So the emphasis here is on flexibility and increasing density for the most part. As you probably know, Brattleboro is notorious for having a very odd arrangement when it comes to planned unit developments, whereas I think unique in Vermont in that we treat a planned unit development process effectively as the same as a zoning district. It has the same regulatory hurdles that you have to jump through as if you were creating a new zoning district. There's some good and some bad about that. One of the good things is that it's permanent and forever. So if you're going to do it that way, then the regulatory setting might be that you should think of it in just the same way as you're doing a zoning change. The downside is that it makes it just as difficult to do as a zoning change, which makes a lot of people very reluctant to do it. So our solution here, and I don't want to get into too much of the administrative details here, I really want to talk about how we're using it for subdivisions, but because we'll talk about PUDs again in a subsequent presentation. There are 5 different PUDs that we've identified here, and so we've developed the concept of thinking of PUDs as a template process. And so there are types of PUDs suited to the appropriate zoning districts that they fit into. So for rural residential and for rural, we've identified specifically 2 different kinds of subdivisions. One is the conservation subdivision, PUDs. One is the conservation subdivision and the other is rural enterprise. And I'm going to go through these fairly quickly and then encourage you to ask as many questions as you want so that you can get to understand this. So the conservation subdivision, we just outlined one process there really briefly that allows you to understand one solution to the problem of dealing with the landscape and the natural and cultural features that exist. What we've got here, this is a perspective drawing that was developed for us as part of this project. This is actually a existing parcel in West Brattleboro. It's a large and famous farm that's well known to everybody, and there's something slightly less than a hamlet in existence there now. There's a cluster of houses around the established farmhouse and farm that anchors this part of this road. And so so up in this corner here, we're outlining the potential boundary for a PUD, and we're showing through various shading steep slope here, 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 and here. So you can tell it's Brattleboro. And then the presence of streams here, as well as here and here. And then you just see in an outline form almost just the existing set of structures. So this is a series of barns and outbuildings and the farmhouse that currently exist. And so what we envisage over here is over time, this rural enterprise, this farm, evolving and the kind of hamlet nature of it becoming a little more clearly rooted. So these small parcels here each accommodate one home, one dwelling unit. They're serviced by this existing farm road, which could be upgraded to just a laneway to service these homes. They're up close to the existing farmhouse and the outbuildings because there's no necessary reason why you wouldn't be. They're on this main road for school bus access and mail and a whole bunch of other services. In return for being able to live in this idyllic setting, they get access to this open space, which still works as working landscape. So the farmer is able to actually sell off these parcels for residential use, take that investment and guarantee that this remains as a working landscape, which becomes an asset and a virtue for each one of these property owners. And in return for that, the rural enterprise, the farm, stays viable. So what we've done is create a tiny hamlet around an existing farm. And so that would be an example of a conservation subdivision, which would be a form of PUD. So they get their rights memorialized and protected in this process. The design process is responsive to the natural conditions. The working landscape remains protected. And these people participate as neighbors effectively and as long-term residents in a neighborhood that they really value, and they know that they're making a contribution to protecting the working landscape. Yeah? Any questions? No? Great.
Might want to go back.
So let's talk now about, so that was the example of the conservation subdivision. The one point there that's important to take away is this numeric requirement, which is about 60% of that open space is protected by an easement. And the example I gave was that it could be used for agriculture, but it could also just as easily be used for passive recreation. So the next example is to talk about rural enterprise. Here we're dealing with a slightly different approach to a similar problem. Many existing farm enterprises or rural enterprises find themselves in a situation where they need to diversify their range of activities to maintain their presence on the farm. So they may become more open to tourism, they may retail from a farm stand or from a small store on site, they may convert existing structures to bed and breakfasts or cabins, they might host conferences or weddings or any number of activities that are strongly tied to the character of the rural property that they own, but not, you know, essentially agriculture in activity, but the use of the space is in response to the agricultural character or setting of the parcel. So some examples locally would include Grafton Cheese Factory, which for a whole lot of complicated reasons that involve building a structure that was historically appropriate, sized and placed in an appropriate way. It houses a modern cheese factory, which is a rural enterprise. It's consistent with the working landscape ethos of the area. It's a tourist attraction in its own right. It's an employment center. It is an important contribution to the local economy and the culture. You could apply a rural enterprise PUD to a process such as that. This photo down here shows a winery.
No.
Oh, sorry.
That's Stonewall Farm.
Oh, sorry. This is Stonewall Farm
in Keene,
New Hampshire. So this is an education center. It runs summer camps, a bunch of other events. Weddings. It's an old farm that's been repurposed for a range of uses. It's still a working farm, but its mandate, it's a not-for-profit, and its mandate is broadly educational and finds other ways of maintaining this working landscape. This example here is a series of cabins, again, making the most of a rural setting that would be a permitted use in a rural enterprise. And then lastly, I think it's a winery. This is definitely a winery. These are grapes. So this could be a bed and breakfast or another cabin. Those are the kinds of uses. This set of scenarios have come up to us partly in surrounding towns, including Dummerston, as well as parts of Brattleboro, where we've already encountered struggles around how to permit and mitigate against some of the unintended consequences of rural enterprise taking place in these areas. So the idea here would be to recognize the current state policy that promotes the working landscape. It's a way of implementing the town plan, and it's a way of ensuring, like I said, if there are any factors associated with noise, traffic, parking, or other associated aspects of use, then they can be explicitly dealt with so that the impact is mitigated and the neighbors don't bear the brunt of these people trying to maximize the use of their land.
And one of the keys there too is that in order to do a rural enterprise PUD, you have to have 9 acres, and part of that is so that you have buffers. Because if you look at that list of uses, you know, there could be light industrial going on in a rural, mostly residential area. So you need at least 3 times the minimum lot size in order to have the space to do this and mitigate the impacts.
Right. Which is, and the traffic and noise question is probably the single biggest issue associated with these uses, and so that buffering becomes an important aspect. Okay, so now we're going to move on to development standards, and we're going to move here pretty quickly.
So these standards would apply to development in a PUD, in a subdivision, or even just plain site plan if you have a stream on your property and you're building a grocery store, and then this riparian buffer might apply to you. So what we're trying to address here is improving water quality, and the treatment aspect of this is really critical because federal regulations are increasingly tying what the water quality in the stream is to the town and development that happens there. We've got Crosby Brook, which has some impairment to it, and so Brattleboro for the most part has flown under the radar with a lot of federal regulations, but that may or may not continue to be the case. And when I say flown under the radar, it's because of the size of our town. So, we want to reduce sedimentation in the streams. We want to maintain the public waterways as an asset, and it's a flood mitigation strategy as well. So it's basically a low-cost way to the town to achieve potential enormous benefit. The riparian area, there's two terms. There's a riparian area, which is all land that is within 50 feet of a mapped surface water. And then in that 50-foot area, most of the development would require conditional use review. So if you're going to be developing there, you're going to need an extra layer of review. There's also a riparian setback that ranges from 15 feet to 100 feet, depending on the zoning district. If you're in the rural zoning district, it's a 100-foot setback because you most likely have the room and it's most likely undeveloped, and so you can get a lot of benefit from putting in the 100-foot. And within the setback, that's an area that you can't develop at all in that area. And it's flexible, so the 15 feet is going to be if you're an undeveloped parcel in the downtown. That's going to be the lowest end of it. So if you're developed in the village center, it might be 25 feet. If you're an undeveloped parcel in the village center, it might be 50 feet. So it's kind of depends on if it's developed, undeveloped, and what zoning district.
And sorry, Sue, who decides that? Who decides the exact distance?
It's in the regulations.
Basically set out as a table in the regulations.
I see.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And within that riparian setback, the land needs to be maintained as in basically a natural wooded vegetated state to stop the water getting into the stream.
Now, what about, like that shows a gradual slope down to the stream, and a lot of our streams have a gradual slope on one side and very steep on the other side, and then it flattens right off, and that certainly is all usable without affecting the water. But it would be within 50 or 100 feet. It's
measured from the top of bank.
Yes.
So that's an interesting question. I need to.
What I'd say.
Which way is it measured? Like if it's a 50-foot slope, or is it 50 feet?
It's a lateral measurement,
right.
And so even if this picture was different and somehow this was a very steep bank and basically the top of this tree was the top of the bank, you'd still be counting 50 feet back from this point here. So you'd still be back in this range. And the reason for that is that a little bit like the Green Street retaining wall explanation, this edge here, I mean, unless it's solid ledge, and we do have examples of solid ledge, if it's established that it's solid ledge, that would be an interesting factor to encounter. But if it's the makeup of much of them, which is even large boulders and a lot of really light glacial till, it's actually very vulnerable to slippage, to failure. And so you wouldn't want, the benefit of the vegetative buffer is that the root system ties the soil together and reduces the likelihood that the slope's going to fail. So even though you've got a steep slope here that could be naturally occurring, it's still preferable to maintain a significant buffer. And further out, you get 50 feet. I think in an urban setting where there's a range of other factors in play, you're going to end up with a much shallower buffer, probably in the range of 15 feet by the time you're in the urban center. So, which is still not insignificant. It's about the length of a car. You put that in perspective, you probably wouldn't want to encourage people, you wouldn't want to make it a hard surface and then have people park the car right on the edge. think here of actually how close cars are parked on the Preston lot to the edge of the whetstone. Right.
And right now, we do have riparian setbacks or stream setbacks on the West River and the Connecticut River.
Right.
But that's it. And this is a common tool.
So this would be an expansion of existing regulations that are so far only applied to the two major rivers in town. Ready to move on?
Yep.
This essentially replaces the fluvial erosion.
No, because this does, no, it's, this does allow development, so even within the buffer area, you can develop, and there's, within the setback area, primarily you can't, but there are a couple of water-dependent uses that you could get down to the stream on.
But this replaces that sort of regulation.
In a good way.
It's an
In whatever way, I mean.
it's an alternative. I mean, it achieves some of the water. It does a bunch of things. It does do flood mitigation. We think it does, because if you slow down the water entering, then
it's a much simpler tool, and it doesn't involve layers of extra analysis in this sense. And we think that the water quality benefits are probably at least as beneficial as the minimizing the impact on the slope. Yeah. And I think in broad terms, at this stage, particularly for the urban sections of our streams, we're at least as concerned about the long-term forecast for federal regulations regarding and state regulations regarding water quality as we are anything else at this point. We're getting to feel that it's coming pretty soon. Okay, so steep slopes. We think that there are a lot of reasons to recommend the regulation of steep slopes. We already mentioned this, but back in 2005 is when the state changed the on-site septic regulations, thus allowing more development, not just of residential, but some commercial activity on steeper slopes. And we think that our land use regulations should reflect this greater flexibility coming from the state. And we also think that there's an important flood mitigation function with regulating on steep slopes. The discussion we just had about slope failure is particularly important for not just even settings where the slope is, you know, that previous shot where we've got the structure here and the stream at the bottom of the slope. We might be thinking much more of a setting where this is the stream and this is the slope, at least this extreme. The possibility of slope failure here is extremely high because of the geological makeup of the area, and we think that that's an important thing to mitigate against. We're not saying no development on steep slopes, we're just saying you're going to have to demonstrate that the impact is going to be minimal, and in particular you'll need conditional use review if it's more than 2,000 square feet of slope land that's going to be disturbed.
There's a table. I would say, let's take that back. We are saying no development on slopes greater than 30%.
30%.
We had that at 25%, but based on conversations with some professionals back when we were doing the subdivision regulations, we did move that to 30% because Brattleboro is quite steep. And then there is a table in the regulations that basically says if you're in this, if you are you 20 to 25% slopes and you're disturbing more than 2,000 square feet, then you need the conditional use review there. So it's kind of a sliding scale.
So to put it in context, the footprint of a regular 3-bedroom home, if you were going to construct it on a steep slope where you might want to have a walkout basement, which is a perfectly reasonable response to steep slope conditions. The footprint of a 30 by 28, 32 to 28 foot home, which is a pretty regular size or in that range for a 3-bedroom home, is 800 square feet. So even if you throw in, a 2-car garage or a barn that's joined to the property, you're still not getting over the 2,000 square foot footprint. So there's plenty of opportunity, we think, for residential development that would literally want to take advantage of a steep slope such as that to enable a walkout basement that would go in under this conditional use requirement. We're talking about pretty large scale, large footprint buildings that we would want to conduct a conditional review of, and then slopes that are in excess of 30%. 30% is arguably too steep for that example I just gave you of a house with a footprint in the range of 800 square feet. You would have to do something to reduce the slope to make a walkout basement viable under those conditions. So we feel like we've tried to settle this at about the right point for the most ranges of development.
And the one other thing on this is this kind of pertains to fluvial erosion too, yes. In that one of the criticisms was, well, you're focusing on the downstream impact, but all the development's happening upland. Well, it all flows down. So this is one tool to kind of watch the development that happens up there and make sure that it's done appropriately to prevent the flooding downstream, mitigate it. And the very last one is stormwater management and erosion control. So we do have regulations on this now. These pictures are to remind you that
why we're talking about this.
Why we're talking about it, why it's important. So we do have, our regulations do look at stormwater management and erosion control. But we are not at all specific as to how it needs to be handled. And so it leaves the DRB with no tools to say, oh, but you could do this, or you could do this. So right now it's kind of whatever the developer proposes. If it works, it's good. And, kind of the old stormwater management, methodology, although it's changing, is to basically get it into pipes and get it off-site. Well, then whose problem does it become? Mostly the towns, because it's running into our stormwater system. So it's another maintenance and costs that we have to incur. So we're looking to the proposed regulations will allow a developer to choose an approach, basically a basic compliance or an alternative approach. And the alternative approach in particular, although I think some of it exists in the basic compliance, is we're moving to more of a low impact development approach. And that's, it tries to prevent and minimize environmental degradation, that's kind of what low impact development is about. It's a bunch of principles. And then there's green stormwater infrastructure, which are kind of the systems and practices. Here's some examples here. So rain gardens, vegetated buffers, pervious pavement, green roofs. You've probably heard about a lot of these. These are tools that applicants can use to manage their stormwater, and it can be incorporated into landscaping. The state, if you could go back to the other slide, Rod. Sure. We would be applying these to 1 and 2 family developments, and it would apply to projects that don't require a state stormwater permit. So if there's 1 acre or greater of disturbance, then you need a state stormwater permit, but there's nothing in that, there's a big gap. And actually, it's quite big. So, if a development is in that area, then they would need to meet the town's regulations, and they're similar to the state's, but we're just trying to push it in a different direction where we're thinking green instead of gray. So, we don't want the infrastructure. We want to use and mimic the natural landscape.
And we think cumulatively, long term, particularly once this approach starts to be implemented in commercial districts as well as the more heavily settled areas of town, that we should be pushing off large-scale upgrades to the existing, as Sue described it, grey infrastructure, because more of this will be taking up that function. And it still has some maintenance component associated with it, but we think that it's more evenly shared between the property owner and the town, and that it can make a substantial long-term contribution to the water quality question again, as well as erosion control and the town's operating budget for infrastructure. So we're happy to take any questions from any slide or any part of tonight's presentation, or even what we're going to talk about next time if you want.
I take it there's more detail in this on-site stormwater infrastructure in the regulations, and all you're really providing to us now is an overview saying we're going to require it, and if you want the detail, you have to look into the regs.
And there's lots of options as to what green stormwater infrastructure you could use.
And then I guess my other question is, you said there were 5 PUD types. I'm not asking for you to talk to us more about it, but you've only talked about 2 of them.
Yes. The other 3 relate. So to put the framework in place a little bit more clearly, for rural and rural residential, there's 2 obvious PUD templates that we think fit. That's the conservation subdivision and the rural enterprise. And so they are, PUDs are permitted in both those zoning districts when you follow one of those 2 templates. For the other zoning districts, including the commercial and industrial, there are other template-based PUD application procedures that we'll get into.
Talk about the next meeting.
Next time.
And so what we've moved away from is the applicant coming up with the concept of the PUD effectively with some loose relationship to the underlying zoning, and we've tied the kind of PUD that you can have to the zoning district that it's going to take place in. So that frees the DRB and the Select Board and the Planning Commission from the endless cycle of meetings to establish all the attributes of the PUD, which is what we do now. So we're talking about not exactly a one-stop shop, but 2 stops at the same shop, which would be PUD going to the DRB and not coming to the Planning Commission and not coming to the Select Board. So you should really...
We haven't done a PUD approval in a long time here.
Yes, that's true. Would you like to do?
No, you haven't.
No, I'm just saying. I don't
No, it takes a long time. I think people don't.
I was just wondering if you missed them or whether you just...
I had plenty when I was on.
Yeah, it's okay. All right.
But it's less red tape.
Yeah.
Right. So it's quicker and easier, but you follow a format. Is basically the way we're going.
Okay. Have any questions?
No. I mean, I do, but
all right. Whether for better or thank you so much for your help.
Thank you, folks.
You're welcome.
Whether for better or for worse, there's 15 minutes worth of stuff we really need to talk about in the executive session. We'll do it quick. I hope everybody will join us. I move to enter executive session to discuss contracts, pending or probable civil litigation to which public body may be a party. Potential confidential attorney-client communications for purpose of providing legal advice, negotiating or securing real estate purchase, with a finding that premature general public knowledge would purely place Select Board, the town, and people involved at substantial disadvantage. And I invite the town manager and maybe the planning director, if he wants to come briefly, the planning director into the meeting. Any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Anybody opposed or abstaining? That carries 5-0. No decision will follow the executive session, and so the broadcast is going to end now, and the recording is going to end now. We will formally adjourn the meeting after the executive session. To anybody who's been watching throughout, thank you for your attention. We'll see you next week.